rang in my swelled head. Years earlier, I had gone into psychoanalysis to get relief. I spent 5.5 years in psychoanalysis and proceeded to become a drunk. I don't mean that in any sense as a derogatory statement about psychotherapy. It's a very great tool. Not too potent, but a great tool. I would do it again. I tried every gimmick that there was to get some peace of mind, but it was not until I was brought to my alcoholic knees when I was brought to a group in my own community with the butcher, the baker, the carpenter, and the mechanic, who were able to give me the 12 steps, and that I was finally given some semblance to an answer to the last half of the first step. So, after taking the first step, and very gingerly admitting myself to Alcoholics Anonymous, something happened. And then I was thought to myself. Imagine an alcoholic admitting anything. But I made my admission just the same. The third step said, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Now they asked us to make a decision. We've got to turn the whole business over to some joker that we can't even see. And this chokes the alcoholic. Here he is powerless, unmanageable, in the grip of something bigger than he is, and he's got to turn the whole business over to somebody else. It fills the alcoholic with rage. We are great people. We can handle anything. And so one gets to thinking to oneself, who is this God? Who is this fellow we're supposed to turn it all over to? What can he do for me that I can't do for myself? Well, I don't know who he is, but I've got my own idea. For myself, I have been absolute proof of the existence of a God. I was sitting in my office one time after I had operated on a woman. It had been a long 4 or 5 hour operation, a large surgical procedure, and she was on her 9th or 10th post-operative day. She was doing fine. She was up and around, and that day her husband phoned me and said, "Doctor, thank you very much for curing my wife." And I thanked him for his felicitations, and he hung up. And then I scratched my head and I said to myself, what a fantastic thing for a man to say that I cured his wife. Here I am down at my hospital behind my desk, and there she is out at the hospital. I'm not even there, and if I was there, the only thing I could do would be to give her moral support. And yet, he thanks me for curing his wife. I thought to myself, what is curing that woman? Yes, I put in those stitches. The great boss has given me diagnostic and surgical talent, and he has loaned it to me to use for the rest of my life. It doesn't belong to me. He has loaned it to me, and I did my job, but that ended 9 days ago. What healed those tissues that I closed? I didn't. This to me is the proof of the existence of somethingness greater than I am. I couldn't practice medicine without the great physician. All I do in a very simple way is to help him cure my patients. Shortly after I was starting to work on the program, I realized that I was not a good father. I wasn't a good husband, but oh, I was a good provider. I never robbed my family of anything. I gave them everything except the greatest thing in the world, and that is peace of mind. So I went to my wife It asked her if there wasn't something that she and I could do to somehow get together. And she turned on her heel and looked at me square in the eye and said, "You don't care anything about my problems." And I could have smacked her, but I said to myself, "Grab on to your serenity." She left, and I sat down and crossed my hands and looked up and said, "For God's sake, help me." And then a silly but simple thought come to me. I didn't know anything about being a father. I didn't know how to come home and work weekends like other husbands. I don't know how to entertain the family. But I remembered that every night after dinner, my wife would get up and wash the dishes. Well, I could do the dishes, so I went to her and said, "There's only one thing I want in my whole life, and I don't want any commendation. I don't want no credit. I don't want anything from you or Janie for the rest of your life, except for one thing, and that is the opportunity to do anything you want, always. And I would like to start off by doing the dishes." And I've been doing the dishes every night. Doctors have been notoriously unsuccessful in helping alcoholics. They have contributed fantastic amounts of time and work to our problem, but they aren't able, it seems, to arrest either your alcoholism or mine. And the clergy have tried hard to help us, but we haven't been helped. And the psychiatrist has had thousands of couches and has put you and me on them many, many times. But he hasn't helped us very much. And though he has tried hard, and we owe the clergy, the doctor, and the psychiatrist a deep debt of gratitude, they have not helped our alcohol, except in a few rare instances. But Alcoholics Anonymous has helped. What is this power that AA possesses? This curative power? I don't know what it is. I suppose the doctor might say it is psychosomatic medicine. I suppose the psychiatrist might say this is benevolent interpersonal relations. I suppose others would say this is group psychotherapy. To me, it is God. Number 5, my chance to live. AA gave this teenager the tools to climb out of her depression. I came through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous at age 17, a walking contradiction. On the outside, I was the portrait of a rebellious teenager with miles of attitude to spare. On the inside, I was suicidal, bloodied, and beaten. My stride spoke of a confidence I didn't feel. My dress was that of a street tough kid you didn't want to mess with. Inside, I was trembling with fear that someone would see through my defense to the real me. If you saw who I really was, you would turn away in disgust, or use my many weaknesses to destroy me. One way or the other, I was convinced I'd be hurt. I couldn't allow that to happen, so I kept the real me veiled behind a force field of rust edge attitude. How I got to this place is still a mystery to me. I grew up in a loving middle class home. We had our problems. What family doesn't? But there was no abuse, verbal or physical, and it certainly couldn't be said my parents didn't do the best they could by me. My grandfathers were alcoholic, and I was raised on the stories of how it had ravaged their lives. and the lives of those around them. Nope, I didn't want to be an alcoholic. In my early teen years, I began to be bothered by feelings that I did not fit in. And until this point, I had ignored the fact that I wasn't one of the in crowd. I thought if I tried hard enough to fit in, sooner or later I would. At 14, I stopped trying. I quickly discovered the soothing effects of a drink. Telling myself I would be more careful than my unfortunate grandparents, I set out to feel better. Drinking released me from the suffocating fear, the feelings of inadequacy, and the nagging voices at the back of my head that told me I would never measure up. All of those things melted away when I drank. The bottle was my friend. Whenever life was too intense, alcohol would take the edge off or obliterate the problem altogether for a time. Blackouts became my goal. Though it may sound strange, they never frightened me. My life was ordered by school and by home. When I blacked out, I simply went on autopilot for the remainder of the day. The thought of going through my teen years without a single memory of its passing was very appealing. I hadn't given up on life, just childhood. Adults had it made. They made all the rules. Being a kid stunk. If I could hold out until I was 18, everything would turn around. I would have no idea at the time how true these words would prove to be. Diving head first into what remained of the subculture left over from the 60s, I took Party Till You Throw Up to new levels. I liked drinking. I liked the effect that alcohol had on me. I did not like throwing up at all. I soon discovered that there were other substances I could take that would help me control my drinking. A little bit of this or a little bit of that, and I could nurse a drink all night. Then I had a good time and didn't throw up. In no time at all, or so I thought, I had a bunch of friends to hang around with. We did exciting things, skipping school, taking road trips, drinking. We're all part of this new lifestyle. It was great for a while. Getting hauled into the principal's office or being questioned by the cops. Things I would have been ashamed of before were now badges of honor. My ability to come through these events without giving away information or being unnerved brought me respect and trust among my peers. Outwardly, I was a young woman who was comfortable with herself. Yet ever so slowly, these actions that I knew deep down were wrong started eating holes in me. My first reaction was to drink more. The outcome was not what I expected. I continued to raise my intake without the desired effect. Blackouts became few and far between. It didn't seem, no matter what I drank or in what combination with other substances, I could not find the relief that I sought. Life at home was falling apart around me. Every time I turned around, I'd done something to make mother cry. At school, they were looking for ways to get rid of me. The vice principal made it a point to explain his position to me in no uncertain terms. Straighten up, or you're out on your ear for good. I started the painful spiral to the bottom, a scant 2 years into my drinking career. Knowing I had to graduate, I made some adjustments to my lifestyle to stay in school. I watched as my friends continued to have fun. A depression settled over me, encasing me in a gray haze. I couldn't skip school no more. My boyfriend come home from boot camp with another girl. My mother was still crying. It was all my fault. There were several attempts at suicide. I'm grateful to say I wasn't very good at it. Then I decided I wasn't having fun anymore. I'd just quit drinking and using. I mean, Why waste good booze if you're going to feel just as bad drunk as sober? I have held no hope for feeling better when I stopped. I just didn't want to waste the booze. It never occurred to me that I could not stop. Every day I concocted some new method of staying sober. If I wear this shirt, I won't drink. If I'm with this person or in this place, I won't drink. It didn't work. Every morning I woke up with a new resolve to stay sober. With a few exceptions, by noon, I was so messed up, I couldn't even tell you my name. The voices in my head became more and more vicious. With each failed attempt, the voice said, "See, you failed again. You knew you wouldn't feel better. You are a loser. You are never going to beat this. Why are you even trying? Just drink until you're dead." On the rare days I managed to make it past noon, there were few brave enough to get within 100 yards of me. I was not a nice person sober. I was angry and frightened, and I wanted you to feel as terrible as I did. Few times I had drinks pushed on me. Here, drink this, and maybe you won't feel so difficult. I always had a nasty retort, and then took what was offered. Toward the end, I prayed every night for God to take me in my sleep, and I cursed him in the morning for allowing me to live. It was never my intention to end up in AA. If someone mentioned perhaps I drank too much, I laughed at them. I didn't drink any more than my friends. I never got drunk when I didn't want to. Never mind that I always wanted to. I couldn't be an alcoholic. I was too young. Life was my problem. Other substances were my problem. If I could just get a handle on things, then I could drink. I got a job as a waitress at a local pancake house. Our late hours attracted a wide variety of clientele, including some members of Alcoholics Anonymous. They were not my favorite people to wait on. They, in fact, drove me to drink. They were very loud, hard to please. They table hopped and didn't tip very well. I waited on the same bunch for 6 weeks in a row before finally being granted the night off. Now I had been thinking that my problem was insanity, and what happened on my night off clinched it. I missed this motley crew who had plagued my existence for over a month. I missed the laughter and their bright smiles, so I went and had a coffee with them. Through a chain of events I chose to believe were the actions of my higher power. They convinced me to go to a meeting. I was told it was a special AA anniversary open meeting, which meant that anyone could attend. I thought to myself, what could it hurt? I wait on these people. Perhaps it will let me better understand them. On the designated evening, I arrived to find that the anniversary meeting was the following week, but they took a vote and decided I could stay. I was shocked and humbled. These people wanted me around. It was a concept I had trouble accepting. I stayed and listened, careful to let them know that I did not have a problem. I attended the anniversary meeting the other following week with no intention of ever going to the next one. I was not an alcoholic. I had other problems that needed attention. Then I'd be all right. The next week, a friend, who was admittedly an alcoholic, asked me if I was going to the meeting. My head went into hyperspeed. If this person thought I needed to go, perhaps I did. But I still wasn't an alcoholic. I attended the meeting and decided drugs were my problem. I stopped using them completely from that night forward. The result was a sharp increase in the drinking. I knew this wouldn't do. Staggering home one night, it occurred to me that perhaps if I stopped drinking for a while, maybe I could get a handle on things, and then I could drink again. It took about 3 months for me to realize I was my problem, and drinking made my problem much worse. The other substances were simply tools to control my drinking. Given a choice, I'd take a drink over the other stuff in a heartbeat. Angry doesn't begin to describe how I felt when I had to admit I might be an alcoholic. Even though I was grateful not to be nuts, as I'd first supposed, I felt cheated. All the people I saw sitting around the tables of Alcoholics Anonymous had been granted many more years drinking than I had. It just wasn't fair. Someone pointed out to me that life was rarely fair. I was not amused, but extending my drinking career was simply not an option. 90 days sober cleared my thinking enough to make me realize I had hit bottom. If I were to go back to drinking, it would be just a matter of time before one of two things happened. I'd succeed at suicide, or I'd start the life of the living dead. I'd seen what the latter looked like, and real death was preferable. At this point, I surrendered. I admitted I was an alcoholic without a clue what to do about it. Many of the people around me wanted me to go to treatment, but I resisted. I didn't want the kids at school to know what was going on. If I went to treatment, they'd all know within a week. More importantly, I was afraid. I was afraid of the treatment center that they would test me and say, "You're not an alcoholic. You are just crazy." My heart knew this wasn't true. My head took me a bit more convincing. The thought of having AA taken away from me was terrifying. AA was my anchor in a sea of confusion. Anything that might pose a threat to my sense of security was quickly thrust away. I didn't have anything against treatment centers then, nor do I now. I simply didn't want to go, and I didn't. I did stay sober. One summer with people who enjoyed sober life was all it took for me to want sobriety more than I ever wanted a drink. I will not tell you I did everything I was told when I was told how I was told it, because I didn't. Like most people new to the program, I set out to find an easier, softer way. As the big book suggests, I could not. When I could not find an easier, softer way, I looked for the person with the magic wand, the one person in AA who could make me all better right now. This was a frustrating task, and I finally realized that if I wanted this life, I was going to have to work at it and do what the others had done. No one made me drink, and no one was going to make me stay sober. This program is for people who want it, not for people who need it. If everyone who needed AA showed up, we would be bursting at the seams. Unfortunately, most never make it to the door. I believe I was one of the lucky ones, not just because I found the program at such a young age. I feel fortunate that I found AA at all. My approach to drinking brought me to the jumping off place, described in the big book, much faster than anyone could have realized. I'm convinced that if I had continued on my course, I wouldn't have survived much longer. I don't believe I was much smarter than anyone else, as I'm often told by those who come at a later age. It was my time, my chance to live, and I took it. There had still been joy in my drinking, or even a remote chance of the joy returning, I would not have stopped drinking when I did. No one who drank as I did wakes up on the edge of the abyss one morning and says, "Things look pretty scary. I think I'd better stop drinking before I fall in. I was convinced I could go as far as I wanted to, and then climb back out if it wasn't fun anymore. What happened to me was I found myself at the bottom of the canyon, thinking I'd never see the sun again. AA did not pull me out of that hole, but it did give me the tools to construct a ladder with the 12 steps. Sobriety is nothing like I thought it would be. First, it was one big emotional roller coaster, full of sharp highs and deep lows. My emotions were new, untested, and I wasn't certain that I wanted to deal with them. I cried when I should have been laughing. I laughed when I should have been crying. Events I thought were the end of the world turned out to be gifts. It was so very confusing. Slowly things began to even out. As I began to take the steps of recovery, my role in the pitiful condition of my life became clear. If asked what the two most important things in recovery are, I would have to say willingness and action. I was willing to believe that AA was telling me the truth. I wanted to believe it was true in a way I cannot relate in words. I wanted this thing to work. Then I began to take the course of action prescribed. Following the principles laid out in the big book has not always been comfortable, nor will I claim perfection. I have yet to find a place in the big book that says, now you have completed the steps. Have a nice life. The program is a plan for a lifetime of daily living. There have been occasions when the temptation to slack off is one. I view each of these as a learning opportunity. When I am willing to do the right thing, I am rewarded with an inner peace no amount of liquor could ever provide. When I am unwilling to do the right thing, I become restless, irritable, and discontent. It has always been my choice. Through the 12 steps, I have been granted the gift of choice. I am no longer at the mercy of a disease that tells me the only answer is to have a drink. If willingness is the key to unlock the gates of hell, it is action that opens those doors so that we may walk freely among the living. Over the course of my sobriety, I have experienced many opportunities to grow. I have had struggles and achievements. Through it all, I have not had to take a drink, nor have I ever been alone. Willingness and action have seen me through it all, with the guidance of a living higher power and the fellowship of a program. When I'm in doubt, I have faith that things will turn out as they should. When I'm afraid, I reach for the hand of another alcoholic to steady me. Life has not heaped monetary riches upon my head, nor have I achieved fame in the eyes of the world. My blessings cannot be measured in those equal terms. No amount of money or fame could equal what has been given to me. Today, I can walk down any street, anywhere, without the fear of meeting someone I've harmed. Today, my thoughts are not consumed with craving for the next drink or regret for the damage I did on the last drunk. Today, I reside among the living, no better, no worse than any of God's other children. Today, I look in the mirror when putting on my makeup and smile, rather than shy away from looking myself in the eye. Today, I fit in my skin. I am at peace with myself and the world around me. Growing up in AA, I have been blessed with children who have never seen their mother drunk. I have a husband who loves me simply because I am. and I have gained the respect of my family. What more could a broken down drunk ask for? Lord knows it is more than I ever thought possible, and ever so much more than I deserved. All because I was believing an AA just might work for me too. Story number 6. A student of life. Living at home with her parents, she tried using willpower to beat the obsession to drink. But it wasn't until she met another alcoholic and went to an AA meeting that sobriety took hold. I started drinking at age 18, rather a late bloomer by today's standards. But after I started, the disease of alcohol hit me with a vengeance, and it made up for lost time. After I had been drinking for several years and seriously wondered if I did indeed have a problem with alcohol, I read one of those "Are you an alcoholic?" quiz type checklists. Much relieved, I found almost nothing applied to me. I had never lost a job, a spouse, children, or any other material possessions through alcohol. The fact that my drinking hadn't allowed me to gain any of those things crossed my mind only after I came into AA. I can't blame 1 ounce of my drinking on my upbringing. My parents were loving and supportive and have been married for 35 years. No one else in my family exhibits alcoholic drinking or alcoholic behaviors. For some reason, despite the resources available to me growing up, I developed into an adult woman, terrified of the world around me. I was extremely insecure, though I was capable of hiding this fact. I was unable to handle and understand my emotions. I always felt as if everyone knew what was going on and they were supposed to be doing, and my life was the only one that was delivered without an instruction book. When I discovered alcohol, everything changed. I took my first real drink my first night at college. I attended which was to be the first of many fraternity parties. I didn't care much for the beer, so I went to the vat of innocuous looking punch. I was told it was laced with grain alcohol. I don't remember how many drinks I had, and my recollections of the actual events of this rest of the night are fuzzy. But I do remember this much. When I was drinking, I was okay. I understood. Everything made sense. I could dance, talk, and enjoy being in my own skin. It was as if I had a piece of unfinished jigsaw puzzle. As soon as I took a drink, the last piece fit in as instantly and effortlessly. I don't remember getting home that night, and I woke up the next morning completely dressed, but in full makeup. I was sick as a dog, but I managed to crawl into the shower and prepare for my first college class. I sat through the entire class pleading with my eyes to the professor to let us out early. He kept us to the bell, and when it rang, I flew into the woman's room, crashed into the first stall, and threw everything up. The insanity of the disease had already manifested itself. I can recall thinking, as I knelt retching in the stall, that this was fantastic. Life was great. I had finally found the answer: alcohol. Yes, I overdid it the night before, but I was new to this game. I only needed to learn how to drink right, and I'd be set free. I attempted to drink right for the next 8 years. My progression was phenomenal. There is no absolutely period in my drinking career that can be described as social drinking. I blacked out almost every time I put alcohol in my system, but I decided I could live with that. It was a small price to pay for the power and confidence that alcohol gave me. After drinking for less than 6 months, I was almost a daily drinker. I wound up on academic probation. I had always been better on the honor roll in high school. My first semester sophomore year, and my response to that was to change my major. My life on campus revolved around parties, drinking, and men. I surrounded myself with people who drank as much as I did, even though several people had already expressed their concern over my drinking. I rationalized that I was only doing what every other red-blooded college student did. Somehow, I managed to graduate, but while most of my friends were securing good jobs and abruptly stopping their boozing, I seemed to be left behind on the campus. I had resolved that I too would now settle down and drink properly, but to my frustration, I found I could not do so. I took a pitiful sales job that paid next to nothing, so I continued to live with my parents. I kept this job for 2 years for one reason. It allowed me to drink with minimal interference. My pattern was to pick up a fifth of whiskey somewhere during my round of appointments and keep it under the car seat with me. When I got home in the evening, I'd drink at least half the fifth in front of the television, sat and watched runs until I passed out. And I did this every night by myself for almost 2 years. I had become a daily, isolated drinker and was starting to get a little nervous. My behavior at this point was textbook. I was stashing bottles all over the house, sneaking drinks from my parents' small supply when I ran out, rationing the number of bottles I threw away at the same time so the trash bags wouldn't clink, refilling my parents' vodka and gin bottles with water, and so on. I had also resorted to videotaping my favorite reruns while I was watching them because I always blacked out before the ending. This time, the TV movie My Name is Bill W. about the co-founder of AA was aired. Intrigued, I sat down with my whiskey and my soda bottle to watch it. When Bill whipped out a flask in the car to bolster himself before a visit with his father-in-law, I heaved a sigh of relief. Oh, I'm not that bad, I thought to myself. Then I proceeded to get drunk and black out. I don't remember any more of the movie. My parents were at a total loss. I was going nowhere, and I was irritable and hostile. Since they had no experience with alcohol, they had no idea what was wrong with me or what to do about it, and neither did I. I knew I drank too much and that my life was miserable, but I never made the connection between those two conditions. My parents made the only suggestion that then made sense to me. They offered to help financially if I wanted to go back to school. Seeing no other way out, I jumped on the opportunity. I spent 2 years in graduate school, 750 miles from home. I can honestly say I know why they call it a geographical cure. For about 9 months, I was able to cut my drinking down sharply. I still drank almost every day, but not to the point of my usual stupors, and I did not black out very often. I was able to concentrate on my schoolwork that first year and made lots of friends. However, geographical cures last only temporarily. Mine lasted a little less than a year. After about 10 months or so, I started slowly to backslide into my old patterns. Steadily, I worked my way back into the same quantities of whiskey I drank at home, and the blackouts returned. My grades started to suffer, and my friends started to wonder. I even began watching reruns again. I had brought my homemade videotapes with me to school. Fortunately, I managed to graduate, but really, I hadn't gone anywhere. After graduation, I returned to my parents' house as I was unsuccessful in securing a job. I was back in my old bedroom, back to the same routine of drinking each morning until I passed out. And it was getting worse. I was starting earlier and earlier and consuming more and more liquor. I had no job, no friends. I saw no one but my parents. I was beyond frustration at this point. Had not I done everything that was expected of me? Had not I graduated from college and gone on to earn a master's degree? I had never gone to jail, crashed any cars, or got into trouble like a real alcoholic would. When I was working, I never missed a day because of drinking. I never ran myself into debt, nor had I abused a spouse or children. Sure, I drank a lot, but I didn't have a problem. How could I when I hadn't done any of the things that prove you're an alcoholic? So what was the problem? All I really wanted was a decent job so I could be independent and productive. I could not understand why life wouldn't just cut me a break. I did odd projects around the house for my parents to earn my keep until I took a job for a local entrepreneur. This job did not offer much opportunity for advancement, nor did it pay very well. But it got me out of the house and it was challenging in many ways. At this point, I was in a vicious battle to control my drinking. I knew that if I took only one drink, I'd lose complete control and drink until I passed out. Nevertheless, I tried day after day to beat this obsession with alcohol. I picked up a gallon and a half of whiskey one day after work and drank over 1/3 of it in less than 4 hours that same night. I was so sick the next day, but I made it to work. When I got home from work, I sat on my parents' sofa and I knew I would start working on that gallon again. Despite the fact I knew I was still very ill from the night before, I also knew I did not want to drink. Sitting on that sofa, I realized that the old "I could stop if I wanted to, I just don't want to" did not apply here, because I didn't want to drink. I watched myself get off of the sofa and pour myself a drink. When I sat back down on the couch, I started to cry. My denial had cracked. I believe I hit bottom that night, but I didn't know it then. I just thought I was insane. I proceeded to finish the half gallon. 6 months later, my boss flew me to California for a trade show. I hated working the shows, but I loved to travel, so I went. I was extremely nervous about this trip because my boss liked to party, and we were flying in a guy our age from Hawaii to work the show with us. At this point, I had managed to hold together 31 days without a single drink, and I was terrified that I might give in to the temptation of being on an all expenses paid trip in a very fun city with two party animals. It had been very difficult for me to stay dry for 31 days. The obsession spoke to me each day. I arrived late on a Friday and managed not to drink that night. The next morning at the show, I was offered the gift that changed my life. Our Hawaiian sales rep seemed frustrated. I thought he was disappointed that he hadn't managed to write an order for a couple he had just finished working with. I went over to console him. He said no. His mood had nothing to do with the couple. Instead, he explained that just this week he had lost his girlfriend, dropped out of school, lost his apartment, and also lost his full-time job. He added, "I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober for a year and a half, except I just drank again this past week. I'm a mess about it." At that very instant, I heard one word in my head. That word was now. I knew it meant something. Say something now. To my amazement, I spoke the words, "Mike, I think I'm one too." Mike's mood changed instantly. I recognized now it was hope. We started talking, among other things. I told him I hadn't had a drink for about a month, but we didn't go to AA. When he asked why I had avoided AA, I told him it was because I didn't think I'd hit bottom. Somehow he didn't laugh, but said, "When you hit your bottom, when you stop digging." He took me to the first 3 AA meetings. It was the second meeting that clinched my resolve to pursue sobriety. There were about 35 people in attendance, but the space was small, so the meeting seemed very crowded. Being from out of town, I stood up and introduced myself when asked to by the chairman. Later on in the meeting, the chairperson called me to share. I got up and somehow walked over to the microphone and podium. I've never been so nervous in my life, but the words came out naturally as I described the events that led up to the meeting that night. As I spoke, I looked around the room. More importantly, I looked at the faces of the people in the room and I saw it. I saw the understanding, the empathy, the love. Today, I believe I saw my higher power for the first time in those faces. Well, still up at the podium, it hit me. This is what I'd been looking for all along. This was the right answer, right here in front of me. Indescribable relief come over me. I knew the fight was over. Later on that night, still reeling from the ecstasy of relief and hope, I remembered the afternoon in the bathroom stall at the college after my first class, when I was so certain I had found the answer in alcohol. I could clearly see now that was a lie. This is the description that fits alcohol best for me. It is a lie, an evil, insidious lie. And I chased that lie for a long time, even when it was obvious that I was going nowhere and killing myself while doing it. At that AA meeting, when I looked out over all those faces, I finally saw the truth. When I returned home, I threw myself into AA. I did 90 meetings in 90 days, got a sponsor, and joined a home group. I did everything that was suggested. I made coffee, took commitments, and got involved with service. I rode the roller coaster of early sobriety. Every second was worth it to get where I am today. It is very important to my recovery to study and to work the steps. To this day, I still make at least 2-step meetings a week. I have a sponsor who guides me through the steps, gently but firmly, with a sure-handedness I hope I am able to emulate the 2 women I now sponsor. The promises have begun to materialize for me, and there's still so much work to do. It is almost impossible to adequately describe how much the program has given me. Even in just these 6 short years, I have been financially supporting myself in my own apartment for 5 years and plan to buy a house next year. I have secured a good job with a promising future. My income has increased more than 150% since I got sober. But just as material losses are not necessary to indicate alcoholism, material gains are not the true indications of sobriety. The real rewards aren't material in nature. I have friends now because I know how to be a friend, and I know how to nurture and encourage valuable friendships. Instead of the prolonged one-night stands I used to call my boyfriends, there's a special man in my life that I've been involved with for almost 5 years. And most importantly, I know who I am. I know my goals, dreams, values, and boundaries. And I know how to protect, nurture, and validate them. Those are the true rewards of sobriety. And they are what I was looking for all along. I am so grateful that my higher power stepped in to show me the way to truth. I pray every day that I never turn my back on it. I came to AA in order to stop drinking. What I found in return was my life. Chapter 7, Crossing the River of Denial. She finally realized that when she enjoyed her drinking, she couldn't control it. And when she controlled it, she couldn't enjoy it. Denial is the most cunning, baffling, and powerful part of my disease, the disease of alcohol. When I look back now, it's hard to imagine I didn't see a problem with my drinking. But instead of seeing the truth when all of the yets, as in that hasn't happened to me yet, started happening, I just kept lowering my standards. Dad was an alcoholic, and my mother drank throughout her pregnancy. But I don't blame my parents for my alcoholism. Kids with a lot worse upbringing than mine did not turn to alcoholics. Well, something, had it been a lot better, did. In fact, I stopped wondering, why me a long time ago? It is like a man standing on a bridge in the middle of a river with his pants on fire, wondering why his pants are on fire. It doesn't matter. Just jump in. And that is exactly what I did with AA once I finally crossed that river of denial. I grew up feeling as if I was the only thing keeping my family together. This, compounded my fear of not being good enough, was a lot of pressure for the little girl. Everything changed with my first drink at the age of 16. All the fear, shyness, and disease evaporated with that first burning swallow of bourbon straight from the bottle during a liquor cabinet raid at a slumber party. I got drunk, blacked out, threw up, had dry heaves, was sick to death for the next day, and I knew I would do it again. For the first time, I felt part of a group without having to be perfect or to get approval. I went through college on scholarships, work study programs, and student loans. Classes and work kept me too busy to do much drinking. Plus, I was engaged to a boy who was not alcoholic. However, I broke off our relationship during my senior year after discovering drugs, sex, and rock and roll companions to my best friend, alcohol. I proceeded to explore all that the late 60s and early 70s offered. After backpacking around Europe, I decided to settle in a large city. Well, I made it all right to full blown alcoholism. A big city is a great place to be an alcoholic. No one notices. 3 martini lunches, drinks after work, and a nightcap at the corner bar was just a normal day. And didn't everyone have blackouts? I used to joke about how great blackouts were because you saved that much time in transit. 1 minute you're here, the next minute you're there. In retrospect, making jokes, just laughing it off, seemed to help solidify my unfaltering denial. Another trick was selecting companions who drank just a little bit more than I did. Then I could always point to their problem. One such companion led to my first arrest. If the driver of the car had only pulled over when the police lights flashed, we would have been fine. If, when I had practically talked our way out of it, if the driver had kept his mouth shut, we would have been fine. But no, he started babbling about how he was in rehab. I got off with a misdemeanor, and for years I was completely discounted that arrest was because it was all his fault. I simply ignored that I had been drinking all day. One morning while I was at work, a hospital called telling me to get there quickly. Father was there, and he was dying of alcoholism. He was 60 years old. I had seen him in hospitals before, but this time it was different. His stomach sorely distended, swollen, his fluids not non-functioning. His non-functioning kidneys and liver could no longer process. He lingered for 3 weeks. Alcoholic death is very painful and slow. Seeing him die of alcoholism convinced me I could never become an alcoholic. I knew too much about the disease, had too much self-knowledge to ever fall prey. I shipped his body back home without attending the funeral. I could not even help my grandmother bury her son, her only son, because by then I was inextricably involved in an affair mired in sex and alcohol, plummeting into the pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization that relationship had become. I had my first drunk driving arrest. It terrified me. I could have killed someone, driving in a total blackout. I came to, handing my driver's license to the patrolman. I swore it would never happen again. 3 months later, it happened again. What I did not know then was that when I had put the alcohol into my body, I became powerless over how much and with whom I drank. All good intentions drowned in denial. I remember joking about how most people spent their entire lives without ever seeing the inside of a jail. And here, a woman of my stature had been arrested 3 times. But I would think I'd never really done hard time, never actually spent the night in jail. Then I met Mr. Wrong, my husband to be, and all that changed. I spent our wedding night in jail, like every other time. However, it wasn't my fault. There we were, still in our wedding clothes. If he had just kept his mouth shut after the police arrived, we would have been fine. I had them convinced that he had attacked the valet because our wedding money was missing. Actually, he thought the valet had stolen the marijuana we were going to smoke. In reality, I was so drunk, I had lost it. During the interrogation of the valet in the restaurant parking lot, my husband became so violent at the officer, he had to put him in the back of the patrol car. When he tried to kick out the rear windows, the policeman retaliated. I pleaded with the officer as a second policeman arrived. Both the bride and the groom were taken to jail. It was then that the stolen marijuana cigarettes were discovered. To my horror, in central booking as they catalogued my belongings, I was arrested for 3 felonies, including drunk and disorderly and 2 misdemeanors. But it was all my husband's fault. I had practically nothing to do with it. He was the one who had a drinking problem. I stayed in an abusive marriage for nearly 7 years and continued to focus on his problems. Toward the end of the marriage, in my misguided attempts to set a good example for him, plus he was drinking too much of my vodka, I mandated a no booze policy in the house. Still, why should I be denied a cocktail after returning home from a stressful day at the office just because he had a problem? So I began hiding my vodka in the bedroom, and still did not see anything wrong with his behavior. He was my problem. I accepted a transfer with a promotion. Yes, my professional life was still climbing. Shortly after the divorce, now, I was sure my problems were over, except that I brought me with me. Once alone in my new place, my drinking took off. I did not have to be a good example to anyone anymore. For the first time, I realized that perhaps my drinking was a bit out of hand. But I knew you'd drink too if you had my stress. Recent divorce, new home, new job, didn't know anyone, and an unacknowledged progressive disease that was destroying me. Finally, I had made some friends who drank just as much as I did. Our drinking was disguised as fishing trips and chili cook-offs, but they were really excuses for weekend-long bitches. After a day's drinking disguised as softball, I nicked an old woman's fender driving home. Of course, it was not my fault. She pulled over in front of me. That the accident occurred at dusk and I had been drinking since 10 a.m. had nothing to do with it. My alcohol had taken me to such depths of denial and heights of ignorance and arrogance that I waited for the police so they'd know that it was her fault too. Well, it didn't take long for them to figure it out. Once again, pulled from the car, hands cuffed behind my back, I was taken to jail. But it wasn't my fault. The old broad shouldn't even have been out on the road. I told myself she was the problem. The judge sentenced me to 6 months in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was outraged. By now, I had been arrested 5 times, but I could not see I was a hard partier, not an alcoholic. Did you people know the difference? So I started to go to those stupid meetings and identified myself as an alcoholic so you'd sign my court card, even though I couldn't possibly be an alcoholic. I had a 6-figure income, owned my own home. I even had a car phone. I used ice cubes, for God's sake. Everyone knows an alcoholic, at least one that has had to go to AA. It is a skid row bum in a dirty raincoat, drinking out of a brown paper bag. So each time you read that part in chapter 5 of the big book that says, if you've decided to go to any lengths to get what we have, my ears were closed. If you had the disease of alcoholism, the last thing I wanted was to be an alcoholic. Eventually, you talked about my feelings in the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous until I could no longer close my ears. I heard women, beautiful, successful women in recovery, talk about the things they had done while drinking, and I would think, I did that, or I did worse than that. Then I began to see the miracles that happen only in AA. People who would crawl in the doors sick and broken, and who in a few weeks of meetings and not drinking one day at a time would get their health back, find a little job and friends who actually cared, and then discover God in their lives. But the most compelling part of AA, the part that made me want to try this sober lifestyle, was the laughter, the pure joy of the laughter that I heard only from sober alcoholics. Still, the thought of getting sober terrified me. I hated the woman I had become, a compulsive, obsessive, daily drinker, not dressing on weekends, always afraid of running out of alcohol. I'd start thinking about a drink by noon, and would leave the office earlier and earlier, or, promising myself that I wouldn't drink that night, I'd invariably find myself in front of the fridge with a drink in my hand, vowing tomorrow I will not drink. I despised all of it, but at least it was familiar. I had no idea what sobriety was like, and I could not imagine life without booze. I had reached that terrifying jumping off point where I couldn't drink any more, but I just could not drink. For almost 23 years, I had done something nearly every day of my life to change reality to one degree or another. Yet, I had to try this sober thing. To this day, I'm amazed at people who got sober before the holidays. I couldn't even attempt it until after the Super Bowl. One last blowout party when I swore I wouldn't get drunk. When I put alcohol in my body, I'd lose the ability to choose how much I drank. And Super Bowl Sunday, that was no different. I ended up on someone's couch instead of my own bed and was sick to death all the next day at work. That week, I had to go to a hockey game. It was a working event, so I really tried to watch my drinking, consuming only 2 cups of beer, which was for me. Wasn't even enough to catch a buzz. And that was the beginning of my spiritual awakening. Sitting near the ice, frustrated, and pondering the fact that 2 tall beers did not give me no relief, something in my head said, and I know it wasn't me, so why bother? At that moment, I knew that the big book meant great obsession, and told about the great obsession of every abnormal drinker being somehow, someday, uh, control and enjoy his drinking. On Super Bowl Sunday, I enjoyed it. I couldn't control it. And at the hockey game, when I did control it, I could not enjoy the game. There was no more denying that I was an alcoholic. What an epiphany. I went to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous the next night, knowing I wanted what you had. I sat in that cold metal chair, just as I had for the past 5 months, and read step one on the wall for the 100th time. But this time, I asked with all my heart for God to help me, and a strange thing happened. A physical sensation came over me like a wave of pure energy, and I felt the presence of God in that dingy little room. I went home that night, and for the first time in years, I did not have to open the cupboard with the half-gallon jug of vodka in it. Not that night or any night since. God has restored me to sanity, and I took step two the very moment I surrendered and accepted my powerlessness over alcohol and the unmanageability of my life. I attended at least one meeting every day, emptied ashtrays, washed coffee pots, and on the day I took a 30-day chip. A friend took me to an AA get together. I was in absolute awe of the power of the 2,000 plus sober alcoholics, holding hands, saying the final prayer together, and I wanted to stay sober more than I wanted life itself. Returning home, I begged God on my knees to help me stay sober one more day. I told God to take the house, take the job, take everything if that's what's needed for me to stay sober. That day, I learned two things: the real meaning of step three, and to always be careful what I prayed for. After 5 months of sobriety, I lost the six-figure job with the firm. The wreckage of my past caught up with me, and I was out of work for a year. That job would have been lost whether I was drunk or sober, but thank goodness I was sober, or I probably would have killed myself. When I was drinking, the prestige on the job was my self-worth, the only thing that made me worth loving. Now I was starting to love myself because AAs had unconditionally loved me until I could. At 5 months, I realized that the world might never build a shrine to the fact that I was sober. But I understood that it's not the world's job to understand my disease. Rather, it's my job to work the program and not drink, no matter what. At 9 months of sobriety, I lost the big house that I bought just to prove to you I couldn't possibly be an alcoholic. I'm between 5 and 9 months. My house was robbed. I had a biopsy on my cervix and I had my heart broken. And the miracle of all miracles was that I didn't have to drink over any of it. This from a woman who had to drink over all of it. I was so unique and so arrogant when I got here. I think God knew that He had to show me early on that there was nothing a drink would make better. He showed me that His love and the power of the steps and the fellowship could keep me from picking up a drink one day at a time, sometimes even an hour at a time, no matter what. A drink would not bring back the job, the house, or the man, so why bother? I found everything I'd ever looked for in Alcoholics Anonymous. I used to thank God for putting AA in my life. Now I thank AA for putting God in my life. I found my tribe, the social architecture that fills my every need for camaraderie and conviviality. I learned how to live. When I asked how I could find self-esteem, you told me by doing worthwhile acts. You explained the big book had no chapters titled Into Thinking or Into Feeling, only into action. I found plenty of opportunity for action in AA. I could be just as busy and helpful to others as I wanted to be as a sober woman in Alcoholics Anonymous. I never was a joiner, but I got deeply involved in AA service work because you told me if I did, I would never have to drink again. You said as long as I put AA first in my life, everything that I put second would be first class. This has proved to be true over and over again, so I continued to put AA and God first, and everything I ever lost was returned many times over. The career that I lost has been restored with even greater success. The house that I lost has been replaced by a townhouse that is just the right size for me. So here I am, sober and successful and serene. Just a few of the gifts of the program for surrendering, suiting up and showing up for life each day. Good days and bad days. Reality is a wild ride. And I wouldn't miss it for the world. I don't question how this program works. I just trust in my God and stay involved in AA service. I go to lots of meetings, work with others, and practice the principles of the steps to the best of my willingness each day. I don't know which of these keeps me sober, and I'm not about to try to find out. It's worked for quite a few days now, so I think I'll try it again tomorrow. Section 8. Because I'm an alcoholic. This drinker finally found the answer to her nagging question. Why? I suppose I always wondered who I was. As a child, isolated in the country, I made up stories, inventing myself, along with imaginary companions to play with. Later, when we moved to a large city and I was surrounded by kids, I felt separate, like an outcast. And although I learned to go along with the cultural norm as I grew up, still, underneath, I felt different. Alcohol helped. At least I thought it helped until I saw the oppressive 30-year shadow it cast on my life. I discovered it in college, and although at first I didn't drink often, or didn't have the opportunity, whenever I started, I drank as long as there was any alcohol around. It was like a reflex. I don't remember liking the taste, but I liked that it seemed to bring me to life and get me through a day or party able to talk. It moved me outside of that hole I felt in myself and lowered the wall I created between me and any person or situation that made me uncomfortable. For 10 years, through college and graduate school, interspersed with jobs, I drank periodically, so it was easy enough to think that I was a social drinker. Looking back, I see that alcohol helped me construct an image of myself as a sophisticated, metropolitan woman, diminishing my feelings of being a backwards country girl. I studied vintage wines and selected them with my care to accompany the gourmet dishes I learned to make. I read about the correct drinks for various occasions. I learned to put just the tiniest whiff of dry vermouth into my martinis. Meanwhile, my tolerance for alcohol grew, so that at first I got sick or passed out, and as time went on, I could hold larger quantities without any visible effects, until the next morning's hangover. Behind the facade, my real life seemed just out of reach. I wanted to consider myself grown up, but inside I felt small and helpless, hardly there at all. I would look at my friends, delightful, interesting, good people, and try to define myself through them. If they saw something in me that made me want to be with me, then I must have something to offer. But their love for me was not a substitute for loving myself. It did not fill the emptiness. So I continued spinning fantasies, and now alcohol fueled my dreams. I would make great discoveries, win the Nobel Prize in medicine and literature as well. Always the dream was somewhere else, further off, and I took a series of geographical cures in search of myself. I was offered a job in Paris and jumped at the chance. I packed my trunk, left my apartment to my boyfriend, and sailed off, thinking that at last I would find my real home, my real self. I began to drink daily and rationalized that in France, of course, you have to have wine with the meals. And after the dinner and the wine, there were liqueurs. My journals and letters bear witness in the deterioration of my handwriting as the evening wore on, drinking as I wrote. It was there, too, that I first became dependent on alcohol. After work, on the way to the Alliance Francaise for classes, I'd stop at a bistro for a glass of cognac to give me the courage to get there. My greater need than the embarrassment of being a woman drinking alone in the 1950s. One vacation, I went to visit friends in Scotland, traveling slowly through the English and Welsh countryside. The bottles of cognac and Benedictine I'd brought as gifts. For them, I drank in the hotel miles outside before I got there. As long as it lasted, I could stay out of the pubs. Europe hadn't proved to be the change that would repair my life, and I started west again. It was Cambridge that I pronounced my first resolutions about cutting down. New Year's resolutions, and I recycled for a dozen years while my drinking and my life kept getting worse. Alcohol had enslaved me. I was in bondage to it. Although I kept assuring myself that drinking was a pleasure and a choice. Blackouts began. Vacant places in my life when hours would disappear, lost to memory. The first time was after I'd given a dinner party. The next morning I woke up without remembering that I'd told my guests good night and gone to bed myself. I'd searched the apartment for clues. The table was cluttered with dessert dishes and coffee cups. Bottles were empty, and the glasses too. It was my custom to polish off any drinks that were left. My last memory was sometimes during dinner. Did we ever finish? But there were the plates. I was terrified that I'd done something horrendous until my friends called to tell me they'd enjoyed the evening. One time we sailed from Guadalupe to a little island for a picnic, swam to shore from the ship. After lunch, and quantities of wine, I was with a French ski instructor talking to a troop of small boys on their way to home from school, trying to explain to those tropical islanders what snow is like. I remember them giggling. The next thing I knew, I was back at the camp, walking into the dining room, apparently after swimming back to the ship, sailing to the port, and then taking a rickety bus across the island. I had no memory of what happened during those hours in between. The blackouts increased. My terror increased with them. Telephone bills would inform me that I'd made late night calls to distant places. I could tell from the numbers whom I'm called, but what had I said? Some mornings I had woke up with a stranger who had brought me home from a party the night before. These things weighed heavily on me, but I couldn't stop the drinking that had caused them. That too gnawed away at any remnants of self-respect I might have had. I was incapable of controlling my drinking and my life. I needed a drink to go anywhere, even to the theater, a party, a date, and later on, even to work. I would leave my apartment, lock the door, and start down the stairs, and then turn around and go back in for another drink to get me where I planned to go. I needed a drink to do anything, to write, to cook, to clean the house, to paint the walls, to take a bath. When I passed out and fell into bed early, I woke up at 4 or 5 and had Irish coffee to start the day. I discovered that beer was better than any orange juice. Afraid of my colleagues or students that would smell my breath while I was at work, I was careful to keep my distance. When I got up late and rushed off to the lab, fortified only with coffee, my hands shook so violently it was impossible to weigh out the milligrams of compounds needed for an experiment. When I went out to lunch with another alcoholic, we may never get back to work that day. Somehow, I still managed to keep my job and most of my friends. Social drinkers who were urging me to cut down on the alcohol. That counsel only made me mad, but I was only concerned about myself. I asked the therapist I was seeing, sometimes with a beer in my hand, would I have to stop? His answer was that we had to find out why I drank. I'd tried this already, but was never able to find out why until I learned the answer in AA. Because I am an alcoholic. With my attempts to cut down, I stopped keeping alcohol around the house. Drank up whatever was there, over and over, deciding not to get more. Then, on the way home after work, or an evening out, I'd have to see if I could scrape together enough money for a bottle. There were liquor stores just about every block, and I rotated them so the salesman wouldn't know how much I drank. On Sundays, when the liquor stores were closed, I had to make do with beer or hard cider from the grocer. Horrors grew, inner horrors. On the surface, it looked as though I was no more or less keeping it together. But day by day I was dying inside, filled with fear I couldn't name, but which shook me to the core. My worst fear was that I might be an alcoholic. I wasn't sure what that was, except that I might end up down on the Bowery in New York, where I had seen drunks curled up on the sidewalk. I made another New Year's resolution to stop drinking entirely until I could handle it, and then I told myself I'd just go back to wine and beer. Hands trembling, body shaky, head splitting. I survived that first day until I was fairly safe in bed in an alcohol-free apartment. Somehow, I made it through a couple more days, miserable in withdrawal, in spite of managing to stay dry that time. I have no doubt that resolution would have crumbled like the others, and I would have been drinking again if I hadn't found AA. I had left the therapist who hadn't been able to tell me why I drank, and on New Year's Eve, I went to party at the home of my new therapist. A few days later in the group, the therapist said, "You're drinking even more than I realized. You're an alcoholic. I think you should stop drinking, see a doctor, and go to AA." My resolution had endured 3 days, and I protested, "I am not an alcoholic." That was my very last denial. "Say it the other way," he suggested. "I am an alcoholic." It come out in a whisper, but it sounded right. I've said it thousands of times since, and with gratitude. What I was most afraid to admit that evening was what would set me free. The therapist told me then and there to call someone who had been in our therapy group, a doctor on the staff of a hospital alcohol service. "I'll call her tomorrow," I said. "Call her now." He handed me the phone. When I asked her if I was an alcoholic, she said that from what she'd seen of my drinking, I might be, and suggested that I talk with her boss. Terrified, I made an appointment and kept it. She told me the symptoms of alcoholism, and I had them all. She gave me a list of AA meetings and recommended one. I went to that meeting, a small women's group. I was scared and in withdrawals. Someone greeted me, and I muttered my name aloud. Somebody brought me a cup of coffee. People gave me their phone numbers and urged me to call, to pick up the telephone instead of a drink. They were warm and friendly. They said, "Keep coming back." And I did. For weeks, I sat in the back rooms, silent, when others shared their experience, strength, and hope. I had listened to their stories and found so many areas where we overlapped. Not all the deeds, but the feelings of remorse and hopelessness. I learned that alcoholism is not a sin, it's a disease. That lifted me of the guilt I had felt. I learned that I didn't have to stop drinking forever, but just don't pick up that first drink. One day, 1 hour at a time. I could manage that. There was laughter in those rooms and sometimes tears, but always love. And when I was able to let that in, that love helped heal me. I read everything I could about this disease I have. My readings recounted the course I had lived and predicted the way I would die if I continued drinking. I had access to a good medical library, but after a while I realized the genetics and chemistry of the disease were of no use to me as an alcoholic. All that I needed to know about it, what would help me get sober, help me recover, I could learn at AA. I was blessed to live in a city where there were meetings at all hours of the day and night. There I would be safe, and there, within a few blocks of my apartment, at last I would find the self I had traveled thousands of miles in search of. The slogans on the walls, which at first made me shudder, began to impress me as truths I could live by. one day at a time. Easy does it. Keep it simple. Live and let live. Let go and let God. The Serenity Prayer. Commitment and service were part of recovery. I was told that to keep it, we have to first give it away. At first, I made the coffee and later volunteered at the intergroup office answering telephones on the evening shift. I went on 12th step calls, spoke at meetings, served as group officer. Ever so gradually, I began to open, just a crack at first, with my hand on the door, ready to slam it shut in a moment of fear. But my fears subsided too. I found that I could be there, open to all kinds of people, from this solid base that we shared. Then I began to go back out into the world, carrying that strength with me. I found that now I could do many things without a drink. Write, answer the telephone, eat out, go to parties, make love, get through the day and the evenings, sleep at night, get up the next morning ready to begin another day. I was amazed and proud to have gone a week without a drink, then a month. It wasn't long until I'd lived an entire year sober, through my birthday, Christmas, problems, and successes, the mixture that makes up life. I healed physically, felt good. My senses returned. I began to hear the delicate sound of autumn leaves rattling in the wind, to feel the touch of snowflakes on my face, to see the first new leaves of spring. Then I began to heal emotionally, to experience feelings that for a long time had been so deeply buried they could have atrophied. For a time I floated on that pink cloud. Then I cried for a year, raged for another. My feelings returned and then began to settle down to reasonable size. Above all, I healed spiritually. The steps took me on that path. I had admitted I was powerless over alcohol, that my life had become unmanageable. That was what got me through the door. Then I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity, and eventually I made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understood God. Years before, in my search, I'd explored numerous religions and dropped them because they never preached a patriarchal God, which I felt never included me. Alcoholics Anonymous, I was told, is a spiritual program, not a religious one. Through my years of darkness, some spark of spirit remained in me that helped me survive until I found my way into AA. Then, nurtured by the program, that inner spirit grew, deepened, until it filled the emptiness I had so long felt inside. Step by step, I moved from a spiritual awakening to a spiritual awakening. Step by step, I cleared up the past, and got on with the present. AA is my home now, and it is everywhere. I go to meetings when I could travel here or to foreign countries, and the people are family. I can know because of what we share. As I write this in my 28th year of sobriety, I am amazed to look back and remember the woman or child I was then, To see how far I've come out of that abyss, Alcoholics Anonymous has enabled me to move from fantasies about what I might do with my life into living it, one day at a time. In my first move, that was not a geographic. I left the city and moved to the country. I left research and became a gardener. I discovered that I am a lesbian and that I love women. I'm fulfilling a long time dream of writing fiction that's being published. But these are things I do, aspects of the life I'm living in sobriety. The most precious discovery is who I really am. Like all of us, a being far beyond any of the ego selves, any of the fantasies I had made up. That sense of being different, which had long plagued me, disappeared when I saw the threads of that run through all of us. Sharing our stories, our feelings, it is the areas where we are the same that impresses me. The differences are but delightful flourishes on the surface, like different colored costumes, and I enjoy them, but the simple basic ways we are humans, the basic ways we simply are, stand out to me now. I come to see that we are all really one, and I no longer feel alone. Chapter 9. It might have been worse. Alcohol was a looming cloud in this banker's bright sky. With rare foresight, he realized it could become a tornado. How can a person with a fine family, an attractive home, an excellent position, and high standing in an important city become an alcoholic? As I later found out through Alcoholics Anonymous, alcohol is no respecter of economic status, social and business standing, or intelligence. I was raised like the majority of American boys, coming from a family of modest circumstances, attending public schools, having the social life of a small Midwestern town with part-time work and some athletics. The ambition to succeed was instilled in me by my Scandinavian parents, who came to this country where opportunities were so great. Keep busy. Always have something constructive to do. I did work all kinds of after school and during vacations trying to find that which would appeal to me most as a goal for life's work. Then there was wartime service to interrupt my plans, and an education to be picked up after the war. After that came marriage, getting started in business, and a family. The story is not very different from that of thousands of other young men in my generation. It shows nothing or no one to blame for my alcoholism. The drive to get ahead, to succeed, kept me too busy for many years to have any great experience with social life. I would have begrudged the time or money for alcohol. In fact, I was afraid to try it for fear that I would wind up like many examples I had seen of drinking in the army. I was intolerant of people who drank, particularly those who drank to an extent that interfered with their on the job performance. In time, I became an officer and director of one of the largest commercial banks in the country. I achieved recognized and national standing in my profession, as well as becoming a director in many important institutions having to do with the civic life of a large city. I had a family to be proud of, actively sharing in the responsibilities of good citizenship. My drinking did not start until after I was 35, and a fairly successful career had been established. But success brought increased social activities, and I realized that many of my friends enjoyed a social drink with no apparent harm to themselves or others. I disliked being different, so ultimately I began to join them occasionally. At first, it was just that, an occasional drink. Then I looked forth to the weekend of golf and the 19th hole. The cocktail hour became a daily routine. Gradually, the quantity increased, and the occasions for a drink came more frequently. A hard day, worries and pressure, bad news, good news. There were more and more reasons for a drink. Why did I want increasingly greater quantities of alcohol? It was frightening that drink was being substituted for more and more of the things I really enjoyed doing. Golf, hunting, and fishing were now just excuses to drink excessively. I made promises to myself, my family, and my friends, and I broke them. Short, dry spells ended in heavy drinking. I tried to hide the drinking by going places where I was unlikely to see anyone I knew. Hangovers and remorse were always with me. The next steps were bottle hiding and excuses for trips in order to drink without restraint. Cunning, baffling, and powerful, the gradual creeping up of the frequency and quantity of alcohol and what it does to a person is apparent to everyone except for the person involved. When it became noticeable to the point of comment, I had to devise ways of sneaking drinks on the side. Rehearsals then became part of the pattern, stopping at bars on the way to or from the place where drinks were to be served, never having enough, always craving more. The obsession for alcohol gradually began to dominate all of my activities, particularly when traveling. Drink planning became more important than any other plan. I tried the wagon on numerous occasions, but I always felt unhappy and abused. I tried psychiatry, but of course I gave the psychiatrist no cooperation. I was living in constant fear that I would get caught while driving a car, so I used taxis part of the time. Then I began to have blackouts, and that was a constant worry. To wake up at home not knowing how I got there, and to realize I had driven my car became torture. Not knowing where I had been or how I got home was making me desperate. It soon now became necessary to have drinks at noon. First, just two, then gradually more. My hours of work were flexible, so that when returning to the office was not always important. Then I became careless and returned sometimes when I shouldn't. This worried me. The last 2 years of my drinking, my entire personality changed to a cynical, intolerant, and arrogant person, completely different from my normal self. It was at this stage of my life that resentments came in. Resenting anyone and everyone who might interfere with my personal plans and ways of doing things, especially for any interference with my drinking. I was full of self-pity. I will never know all the people I hurt, all the friends I abused, the humiliation of my family, the worry of my business associates, or how far-reaching it was to say, I had to continue to be surprised by the people I met who said, "You haven't had a drink for a long time, have you?" The surprise to me is the fact that I didn't know that they knew my drinking had gotten out of hand. That is where we were really fooled. We only think we can drink to excess without anyone's knowing it. Everyone knows it. The only one we are fooling is ourselves. We rationalize and excuse our conduct beyond all reason. My wife and I had is always encouraged our children to bring their friends home at any time. But after a few experiences with a drunken father, they eliminated the home as a place to entertain friends. At the time, this didn't mean much to me. I was too busy devising excuses to be out with the drinking pals. It seemed to me my wife was becoming more intolerant and narrow-minded all the time. Whenever we went out, she appeared to go out of her way to keep me from having more than one drink. What alcoholic can be satisfied with one drink? After every cocktail party or dinner party, she would say she couldn't understand how I could get in such a drunken stupor on one drink. She, of course, didn't realize how cunning an alcoholic can be, and the lengths to which he will go in finding ways to satisfy the compulsion for more and more drinks after had the first one. Neither did I. Finally, our invitations became fewer and fewer as friends had more experience with my drinking problem. 2 years before I joined AA, my wife took a long trip, which she wrote me she just couldn't return unless I did something about my drinking. It was a shock, of course, but I promised to stop, and she came home. A year later, while we were on a vacation trip, she packed up to go home because of my excessive drinking, and I talked her out of it with the promise. I swore I would go on the wagon for at least 1 year. I promised, but within 2 months, I began again. The following spring, she left me one day without giving me any idea of where she'd gone, hoping this would bring me to my senses. In a few days, an attorney called me and explained that something would have to be done, as she couldn't face returning to me as I was. Again, I promised to do something about it. Broken promises, humiliation, hopelessness, worry, anxiety, but still not enough. There comes a time when you don't want to live and are afraid to die. Some crises bring you to a point of deciding to do something about your drinking, to do anything. Help you. Once continually rejected, suggestions once turned aside are finally accepted in desperation. The final decision came when my daughter, following a drunk of mine that ruined my wife's birthday, said, "It's Alcoholics Anonymous or else." Of course, this suggestion had been made before on a number of occasions, but like all alcoholics, I really wanted to handle my problem my way, which really didn't mean I wanted to try anything that would interfere with my drinking. I was trying to find an easier, softer way, but by now it had become difficult to visualize a life without alcohol. However, my low had been reached. I realized I had been going down and down. I was unhappy myself, and I had brought unhappiness to all who cared for me. Physically, I couldn't take it anymore. Cold sweats, jumpy nerves, and lack of sleep were becoming intolerable. Mentally, the fears and tensions, the complete change in attitude and outlook bewildered me. This was no way to live. The time for decision had arrived, and it was a relief to say yes when my family said they would call Alcoholics Anonymous for me. A relief, even though I dreaded it, feeling that this was the end of everything. Early the next morning, a man whose name I knew well, a lawyer, called on me. Within 30 minutes, I knew AA was the answer. We visited most of that day and attended a meeting that night. I don't know what I expected, but I most certainly didn't visualize a group of people talking about their drinking problems, making light of their personal tragedies, and the same about themselves. However, I had heard a few stories of jails, sanitariums, broken homes, and Skid Row. I wondered if I really was an alcoholic after all. I really hadn't started to drink early in my life, so I had some stability and maturity to guide me for a while. My responsibilities had been a restraining influence. I had had no brushes with the law, though I should have had many. I had not yet lost my job or my family, even though both were on the verge of going. My financial standing has not been impaired. Could I be an alcoholic without some of the hair-raising experiences that I hear in some of the meetings? The answer came to me very simply in the first step of the 12 steps of AA. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. This didn't say we had to be in jail 10, 50, or 100 times. It did not say I had to lose 1, 5, or 10 jobs. And it didn't say I had to lose my family or end up on Skid Row and drink by bay rum, canned heat, or lemon extract. It did say I admitted that I was powerless over alcohol, that my life had become unmanageable. Most certainly I was powerless over alcohol, and for me, my life had become unmanageable. It wasn't how far I had gone, but where I was heading. It was important to me to see what alcohol had done to me so far and would continue to do if I didn't have help. At first, it was a shock to realize that I was an alcoholic, but the realization was there, and it made hope easier. The baffling problem of getting drunk when I had every intention to stay sober was simplified. It was a great relief to know that I didn't have to drink anymore. I was told that I must want sobriety for my own sake, and I am convinced this is true. There may be many reasons that bring one to AA for the first time, but the lasting one must be to want sobriety and the AA way of living for yourself. From the start, I liked everything about the AA program. I liked the description of the alcoholic as a person who has found that alcohol is interfering with his social or business life. The allergy idea I could understand because I am allergic to certain pollens. Some of my family are allergic to certain foods. What could be more reasonable than that some people, including myself, were allergic to alcohol? The explanation was that alcoholism was a disease of a twofold nature: an allergy of the body and an obsession of the mind, cleared up by a number of puzzling questions for me. The allergy we could do nothing about. Somehow our bodies had reached the point where we could no longer absorb alcohol in our systems. The why is not important. The fact is that one drink will set up a reaction in our system that requires more. That one drink is too much, and 100 drinks are not enough. The obsession of the mind has a little harder to understand, and yet everyone has obsessions of various kinds. The alcoholic has them to an exaggerated degree. Over a period of time, he has built up self pity and resentments towards anyone or anything that interferes with his drinking. Dishonest thinking, prejudice, ego, antagonism towards anyone and everyone who dares to cross him, vanity, and a critical attitude are character defects that gradually creep in and become a part of his life. Living with fear and tension inevitably results in wanting some ease. To ease that tension, which alcohol seems to do temporarily, it took me some time to realize that the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous were designed to help correct these defects of character and so help remove the obsession to drink. The 12 steps, which to me are a spiritual way of living, soon meant honest thinking, not wishful thinking, open mindedness, and a willingness to try, and a faith to accept. They meant patience, tolerance, and humility, and above all, that the belief in a power greater than myself could help. That power I chose to choose, called God. A willingness to do whatever I was told to simplify the program for me. Study the AA book. Don't just read it. They told me to go to meetings, and I still do at every available opportunity, whether I am at home or in some other city. Attending meetings has never been a chore for me, nor have I attended them with the feeling of just doing my duty. Meetings are both relaxing and refreshing to me after a hard day. They say, get active, so I help whenever I can and still do. A spiritual experience to me meant attending meetings and seeing a group of people, all there for the purpose of helping each other. Hearing the 12 steps and the 12 traditions read at a meeting, and hearing the Lord's Prayer, which in AA meetings has such a great meaning. Thy will be done, not mine. A spiritual awakening soon came to me, trying each day to be a little more thoughtful, more considerate, a little more courteous to those with whom I'd come in contact. To most of us, making amends will take the rest of our lives, but we can start immediately. Just by being sober, we will be making amends to many we have hurt by our drunken actions. Making amends is sometimes doing what we are capable of doing, but fail to do so because of alcohol. Carrying out community responsibilities such as community funds, Red Cross, educational and religious activities in proportion to our abilities and energy. I was desperately earnest to follow through and understand what was expected of me as a member of AA, and to take each step of the 12 as rapidly as possible. To me, this meant telling my associates that I had joined Alcoholics Anonymous, that I didn't know what was expected of me by AA, but that whatever it was, the most important thing in my life was staying sober. Staying sober was so important, it must come ahead of anything. There are many short phrases and expressions in AA that make sound sense. First things first. Solve our immediate problems before we try to solve all the others and get muddled in our own thinking and doing. Easy does it. Relax a little. Try for inner contentment. No individual can carry all the burdens of the world. Everyone has problems. Getting drunk won't solve them. 24 hours a day. Today is the day. Doing our best. Living each day to the fullest is the art of living. Yesterday is gone, and we don't know whether there'll be a tomorrow. If we do a good job of living today, and if tomorrow comes, then the chances are we will do a good job when it arrives. So why worry about it? The AA way of life is the way we always should have tried to live. Grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. These thoughts became part of our everyday lives. They are not ideas of resignation, but the recognition of certain basic facts of living. The fact that AA is a spiritual program did not scare me or raise any prejudice in my mind. I couldn't afford the luxury of prejudice. I tried my way, and it failed. When I joined AA, I did so for the sole purpose of getting sober and staying sober. I did not realize I would find so much more. But a almost new and different outlook on life started opening almost as many doors immediately. Each day seems to be so much more productive and satisfying. I get so much more enjoyment out of living. I find an inner pleasure in simple things. Living just for today is a pleasant adventure. Above all, I am grateful to AA for my sobriety, which means so much to my family, friends, and business associates, because AA and God were able to do something for me that I was unable to do for myself. Chapter 10, Tightrope. Trying to navigate separate worlds was a lonely charade that ended when this gay alcoholic finally landed in AA. Drinking was always a part of my family background. All the men in my family drank. Father, and later my brothers, were heavy drinkers. As long as a person held down a job, didn't embarrass his family or friends too frequently, and kept out of trouble, he was entitled to get drunk on a regular basis. Drinking was an adult thing to do, a part of growing up. I don't believe it ever crossed my mind that I shouldn't drink. I was raised in a conservative religion, and I commuted to religious school some distance from home. Because I had a quick mind and was comfortable with academics, I became something of a teacher's pet. As a result, I was serious, shy, somewhat bookish child, and a teenager who found it difficult to relate to my peers. So when I went away to college, I was an alcoholic waiting to happen. My relation to alcohol was a love affair from the very beginning. Although I wasn't too thrilled with the taste, I sure loved the effects. Alcohol helped me hide my fears. The ability to converse was almost a miraculous gift to a shy and lonely individual. At this time that I also began to struggle with the question of my sexuality. For me, the idea of being a homosexual, the word gay, wasn't then in common use. In fact, it was unthinkable. Drinking helped me to forget and to evade. Also, it provided some cover. When you are drunk, people are not surprised at an inability or a disinclination to make any serious moves towards a woman. This struggle continued throughout years of unsuccessful dating and pretending. When I eventually decided to act on my desires, the guilt and the shame, as well as the drinking, increased. Now, I had to hide not only my thoughts, but my conduct as well. I always tried to project the image of the conservative, masculine, deep voiced loner with the mysterious, possibly tragic, but always heterosexual love affair in the past. I would wound up living two separate and distinct lives, that of a gay man with friends and interests to match that of the straight man with a totally separate set of friends and interests. I had to walk this tightrope while trying to build a solid professional life as well. After college, I had gone on to law school, where drinking on a daily basis became normal. I justified myself with the thought that a few drinks would help me relax and focus on my studies. Somehow, I managed to do well in law school and landed several prestigious legal positions afterwards. I soon learned that I could not drink during the day. If I had even one drink at lunch, the rest of the afternoon would be lost. Instead, I postponed my drinking until immediately after work and would make up for lost time. Work in a law firm added a third side to my already divided life. Now, I had to try to maintain social relations with clients, members, and associates of the firm. In addition to my gay and straight friends from my private lives, needless to say, as the drinking increased, things became ever more confused. Eventually, the pressures became too great. I had formed a serious relationship and decided that I could no longer carry on the deception. Instead, I would change careers and go into teaching. For a while, things seemed to be going very well, but the slide towards active alcoholism was slowly accelerating. I had had my first blackout several years before. At that time, I told myself if it ever happened again, I'd quit drinking. But sure enough, it happened again, and again, and again. But I didn't stop. I was always able to come up with some explanation, some excuse or rationalization that justified my continuous drinking. In time, personality changes began to occur with regularity when I drank. I had always had a sharp tongue. When I was drinking, I frequently became vitriolic. At some other times, I could be so charming and affectionate, sometimes too much so. People never know just what I would do or say. After a few years, I was a nightly blackout drinker. My lover drank heavily as well, and I began to compare my drinking with his. I argued to myself that I could not possibly have a problem because his drinking was worse than mine. In fact, I suggested that he might try AA. When he did try the fellowship, all I did acknowledge, all I could do was undermine his efforts to get sober. His recovery would present an obvious, if unacknowledged, threat to my drinking. Eventually, the stress became too much and we broke up. But not before I had succeeded in undermining his recovery. The slide continued. Most of my friends were unwilling to put up with my conduct. The verbal and sometimes physical abuse, the midnight phone calls, the forgotten invitations, and the selfish disregard of anything but my own need to drink. Those few friends who did not withdraw were forced away because of my resentments and increasing paranoia. I cut people out of my life, refusing to return phone calls and ignoring them when we met by chance. By the end of my drinking, only two people were willing to have anything to do with me on a social basis, and both were heavy drinkers as well, who were not really surprised by my actions. The cases in which disaster struck when I drank outside the home increased. I made inappropriate passes at parties or people at work, both men and women. At other times, I awakened, battered, or with my watch or wallet missing, or in the company of strangers whose names I did not remember and did not want to know. There were the inevitable injuries and accidents. I'd be ejected from bars because I would steal tips or change from bartenders or other customers to pay for the drinks I could no longer afford. Sometimes I would get into arguments and be forced to leave. In cognizance, I made the seemingly logical decision not to drink outside the house. Instead, most of my drinking was now solitary. When I left work, I would have a few stiff drinks at dinner and then go home. I would stop off at the kitchen to pick up a glass, some ice, and some mixer. I would go to my bedroom where I kept half-gallon bottles of gin and vodka and read while the ice melted. The mixer ran out, and sometimes the glass broke. Every night then was blackout drinking. The really bad times were when I would have to struggle outside to a liquor store or bar late at night, weaving, trying not to stagger, because I had miscalculated and run out of alcohol. I found it increasingly difficult to do anything more than work and drink. I was afraid to use public transportation or even walk on the streets. My stomach was constantly upset, and my doctor had diagnosed a number of intestinal disorders. Even though I rarely drank away from home, my body was covered with bruises because I often fell down during blackouts. I never wore short-sleeved shirts, even in summer, because people would ask me about the bruises. One morning, I awoke with a numb leg and found that I had somehow ruptured two spinal discs while in a blackout at home. For the next 4 years, I lived alone in a small house. The ceiling of one room had collapsed, and plaster was everywhere. Plaster dust coated the garbage and the newspapers that littered the floor. Empty food cartons, beer cans, bottles, dirty clothes lay everywhere. They were tossed. I had gotten a cat because the mice were out of control, but I was not conscientious about cleaning up after that cat. It's not surprising that I had a few visitors, and neighbors tend to avoid me. The last few months were filled with fear and self-pity. I began to complicate suicide with increasing regularity. Yet, I was afraid of dying. I remember thinking that this life would go on and on, never getting better, just slowly fading away into nothing. Then I began to hear the whispers. I began convinced that there were people living in my house. I couldn't see them, except for a few occasional glimpses out of the corner of my eyes. And so I concluded that they were small and somehow living in the walls or even under the stairs. I could hear them plotting to kill me. There were nights when I went to bed with a knife in hand to protect myself. Other nights, I locked myself in the bathroom so they couldn't get me. One night, I left a shot of vodka on the mantelpiece so they would go after that and leave me alone. Then a miracle occurred. An evening came when I decided to have one drink outside, then go straight home. I had that drink and left for the house. The next thing I remember is waking up the next morning with the stranger I'd picked up at a bar. Apparently, I'd gone on autopilot and, in a blackout resulting from just one drink, I'd gone on a tear. The look of disgust and pity on the face of that stranger was the jolt I needed. I suddenly realized that my life was totally insane, that my drinking was out of control, and that I was either an alcoholic or a candidate for committal to the local asylum. Not wanting to be locked up, I decided to try Alcoholics Anonymous. I called my former lover, and he put me in contact with an individual who took me to my first meeting. Although I can barely recall anything about that meeting, I heard two things I have never forgotten. The first was, "You don't have to drink again." This was a total revelation to me. For a long time, I believed that alcohol was one of the few positive things left in life. I looked forward to my first drink every evening and thought that alcohol was holding my life together. I had to drink to survive, let alone to have any comfort. Yet here, people who had been in the same boat were telling me that I didn't have to drink. I don't think I believed them that night, but it gave me enough hope to avoid drinking the rest of the day. The second thing I heard was, "You don't have to be alone anymore." This too was a revelation. For years I had been rejected, or I had been rejected by friends, lovers, family, and God. I was alone and afraid. My life had narrowed to work and the bottle, and work remained in the picture only because it was necessary to enable me to purchase the bottle. The isolation and loneliness that alcoholism brought weighed heavily upon me. And as those words lifted an immense burden of fear, again, I'm not so sure that I completely believed, but I did feel hope for the first time in years. I did not fall in love with AA at first glance. The man who took me to my first meeting later became my first sponsor, and he had to put up with objections, arguments, questions, and doubts. Everything a trained but very muddled legal mind could throw at him. He was gentle with me. He did not push his opinions on me. He had the sense to see that I was so afraid and so used to being alone that I could not face a hard sell approach. He listened to my questions, answered some, and suggested that I could best answer others myself. He refused to argue, but was willing to explain and share his own experiences. I had asked him to be my sponsor before I knew what he did for a living, and I felt he could not back out of the relationship when I discovered he was a minister. My alcoholism and my lifestyle had led me to reject the religion and the God of my upbringing. I had never replaced them. Instead, I was an agnostic, doubting the existence of God, but afraid to say so in case it was wrong. My self-pity and sense of victimization led me to doubt that a caring God could exist. If he did, why had he given me so many troubles? I was very wary of the members who talked of their spiritual lives. My sponsor was a living damper on my intolerance. But even more, he taught me that it would be all right for me to doubt God, that AA was not a religious program, and to belong, I did not have to adhere to any set of beliefs. He suggested that for me, a good starting point would simply be recognition of the fact that I had failed in running the world. In short, acceptance of the fact that I was not God. He also suggested that I might try occasionally to act as I believed. Somewhere, and I heard that it's easier to act yourself into a new way of thinking, into a new way of acting. This made sense in the context of acting as if. I also thought that the people in the meetings seemed too standoffish and overly concerned with their new friends and acquaintances, rather than me, the newcomer. I was well on my way toward developing resentment. I expressed this to my sponsor. He suggested that I might find the people more communicative if I took the coffee making commitment for the group I joined. Although I was far too special to make coffee, I did figure that coffee maker I would have the chance to select decent cookies. So I agreed. My sponsor was right again. People did start to speak with me, but if only to complain about the coffee and cookies. But once a conversation starts, communication frequently continues. I started working the steps. And even with my difficulty over the third step and the God concept, I began to develop a sense of trust in the AA group and in the ideals of the fellowship as a manifestation of a power greater than myself. Although for many years I did not come to an acceptance of a God who intervened personally and directed the lives of individuals, I was able to accept the idea of a force that moved in the rooms and animated AA members with an unconditional sense of love. That satisfied my spiritual needs for a long time. A later sponsor took me through steps 8 and 9 and provided me with support during some of my trying times. In my third year of sobriety, I was bedridden for over a month as a result of earlier injury to my spinal discs. My father died, a relationship ended, and the AIDS epidemic started to hit home among my friends and acquaintances. Over the course of that and the next few years, almost half of my gay friends died. I learned in that year that if I ask for help, my higher power will never give me anything I can't handle. It was in this period I started to turn to service beyond the group level. I had helped in founding the first gay AA group in my part of town and was elected general service representative after having served in other group offices. I knew nothing of general service at that time, and I decided to learn what it was all about so I could do a decent job and be able to pass it on to his successor as quickly as possible. After 2 years, I went on to do a number of other service jobs for AA. In all these positions, I never felt obligated to conceal or deny my sexuality. I have always felt that the representatives of my group in my area were concerned only with how we carried the message of personal recovery, not with what I might do in my personal life. When I first came to this fellowship, I had lost my health, my sanity, my friends, much of my family, my self respect, and unfortunately, my God. In the years since, all of these have been restored to me. I no longer have the sense of impending doom. I no longer wish for death or stare at myself in the mirror with loathing. I've come to terms with my higher power. After more than a dozen years in the AA fellowship, I was able to join a religious group and now become active in that organization. I have a full, happy life with friends and loving family. Recently, I retired and have begun to travel throughout the world. I have attended and felt welcome at AA meetings wherever I've gone inside and outside the United States. Even more important, I have returned to my home group and am still asked to make coffee. I now have an extended family that is international in scope. All the members of which are joined by bonds of shared pain and joy. Chapter 11. Flooded with Feeling. When a barrier to God collapsed, this self-described agnostic was at step 3. When I first come to AA, I thought everyone had drunk more than I had, but everybody had gotten into more trouble. But I kept coming to meetings, and after a while I began to hear the beginnings of their stories. I come to realize that I was on the same road. I just hadn't got that far yet. I had my first drink in my senior year of high school. That first night, I slipped out of the window so my parents wouldn't hear me leave. There were four of us. We only brought 4 bottles of homebrew. I never made that mistake again. The next week, a bunch of us went camping and we bought cases of beer. We finished it all. The others drank a lot too, but I was the one who woke up in the middle of the night and started wandering around the countryside by the light of the moon. I was the one who walked for miles searching for something. I now know what I was looking for. Unlike the rest of them, I just wanted another drink. I had a great time that summer between high school and college. It revolved around drinking and football, drinking and hunting, drinking and playing pool, drinking and driving. Nothing too bad happened, but it could have. In fact, I nearly got arrested. A friend just missed being shot. The car I was riding in stopped just before it crashed. I don't think most moderate social drinkers remember so clearly the night they had their first drink. I'm sure that very few of them make it that date into an annual celebration by getting drunk as possible. It was my second year of drinking that I started saying that if you can feel your face, you're not drunk enough. In my third year, I drank homemade peach wine, and when it was gone, I had some whiskey. That night, I vomited in a blackout. Soon, I figured out I didn't need to get as sick on vodka. Drinking vodka was like something out of science fiction. I could be someplace one moment and instantly transported somewhere else the next. I could never seem to find that happy balance. I remember going to a party. I started drinking, and suddenly I could talk to anyone. I was having a lot of fun, but I kept on drinking. Soon I could barely walk. A friend drove me home that night, but I sometimes drove a car when I was too drunk to walk. I became a teacher and didn't drink too often for a while. When I did drink, I almost always got drunk. The teachers would get together a couple times a year for a poker party. I usually didn't drink anything. One time I did, and I made a fool of myself. I decided that drinking wasn't no fun no more, so I quit. My cure for drinking was isolation. I would get up, go to work, come home, watch TV, and go to bed. It got to the point where I couldn't remember anything good that ever happened. I couldn't imagine anything good ever happening in the future. Life had shrunken down to an endless, awful now. The depression became so bad that only medical treatment kept me from killing myself. After several months, the doctor took me off the meds. I wasn't suicidal, but I wasn't very happy either. A new teacher came to my school, and I invited myself over to her place for a drink. I remember telling her, as I lifted the glass, that this might not be such a great idea, but I think it's worth the risk. As casually as that, I began drinking again. As the winter break, she went to visit her boyfriend. I was alone again. 2 days before Christmas, I'd went to a party. I wasn't going to drink because I had driven there, and I knew drinking and driving was a bad idea. I wasn't feeling particularly good or bad, just a little uncomfortable because I didn't know most of the people there. I was sitting on the couch one minute and drinking up an extra wine in a glass the next. There was no conscious premeditation at all. This is the point when many people say, and I went on drinking for 10 more years. Instead, an odd thing happened. A few days later, a teacher came up to me at work. She said that I might be an alcoholic and she was going to AA. She had never seen me drink, so I don't know what to say that made her do that. The next week, I asked her how often she went to meetings. Once a week, I asked. No. She said she had been going nearly every day for almost 6 months. That seemed a little extreme, but I thought that maybe if I went to a meeting with her, it might help her out. Besides, I was lonely. Halfway through the meeting, I had the strangest idea. People were introducing themselves as alcoholics, and I had the urge to do the same. This was peculiar because I wasn't one, of course. Later, my friend asked me what I thought of the meeting. I said that I didn't really know. It was only much later I realized that for the first time in years I felt that I belonged. The next day we went to another meeting, and this time I did say I was an alcoholic. I went to the third meeting by myself. I was nervous. I felt as if I were about to jump out of my skin. But I did something that was amazing to me. Before the meeting, I stuck out my hand and I introduced myself as a newcomer. I had someone to talk to. I calmed down. From time to time, I would tell the truth. I said in the meeting that I was afraid to get a sponsor because I was afraid he might ask me to do something. I left that meeting with a phone number. I called it, and sure enough, my new sponsor started leading me through the steps using the big book. I called him every day. I told him they just did not want to be an alcoholic. He said it didn't matter what I wanted. The question I had to answer for myself was whether I was or I wasn't. He even suggested that I could try a little controlled drinking if I wasn't sure. I knew I had never been able to do that. I really didn't need to do no more research. All I really had to do was review the drinking I had already done. I remember telling a friend years ago that I did not have a drinking problem. I had a stopping problem. We laughed. It was true, but there was something else going on, something that never occurred to me until I came to AA. I didn't just have a stopping problem. I had a starting problem too. No matter how often I stopped or for how long, I always started drinking again. After not drinking for 3 months, I was on the phone with the friend who had taken me to that first meeting. I was complaining to her about problems at work and how my sponsor didn't understand me. Later in the conversation, I mentioned that even when I described myself as agnostic, I thought maybe something was watching me. She asked, "Isn't it about time you made a decision?" I knew where to look in the big book, and I had been careful to avoid it until then. Then I turned it over to the third step prayer and quietly read it to her over the phone. Nothing happened. I didn't expect anything to happen. Then, for some reason, I turned back to the words. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. They echoed in my mind. Something happened. A barrier collapsed. Without moving or speaking, I was carried away on a flood of emotion. Yet, at the same time, I was completely aware of myself and surroundings. I could hear my friend's voice asking what had happened to me. I couldn't have answered. I still can't even explain it. I know then I had took the third step, turning my will and my life over to a higher power. That night, because I began writing a fourth step inventory the next day, and I continued to write until I did the fifth step with my sponsor. Soon, I had a list of people I had harmed. I talked about each of the events with my sponsor. By the time I started setting things straight with my family, I began to feel a lot better. More often than 11 years later, it is hard to capture the feelings of that night. What do I believe as a result? I can say that doubting God's existence was no barrier at all to a spiritual experience. Also, I could say that having such an experience didn't lead me to any certainty about God. Alcoholics Anonymous gives me the freedom to believe and to doubt as much as I need to know. I do know that my life is different now. I haven't had a drink since I came to AA. I have fewer resentments, and I don't spend much time thinking about the past. I found that my experience can be of help to other people. I've come to believe that hard times are not just meaningless suffering, and that something good might turn up at any moment. That's a big change for someone who used to come in the morning feeling sentenced to another day of life. When I wake up today, there are lots of possibilities. I can hardly wait to see what's going to happen next. I keep coming back because it works. Chapter 12. Winner takes all. Legally blind, but no longer alone, she found a way to stay sober, raise a family, and turn her life over to the care of God. My parents were very much in love and had decided to be married a couple years and start a family. They were so excited when their first son was born. They even owned their own small business, and with the arrival of their son, their lives seemed perfect until tragedy struck. When their son was about 2 years old, my parents were eating at a local restaurant. He was dancing to the music of the jukebox and having a good time. He followed some older children outside and was hit by a car. My parents carried him away in an ambulance to a hospital 30 miles away, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. My parents were stricken with grief. One miracle that brought them some joy in the midst of all the pain was that Mom found out she was pregnant. When this little girl was born, she brought them great joy. She did not take the place of her brother, but in her own right, she did bring them joy. They tried to have another little boy, but they had me instead. Not only was I a girl, but I was also born legally blind. A year or so later, they finally did get the boy they wanted, and there was a big party to celebrate his birth. From the very beginning, I felt different and unwanted. At a very young age, as children do, I had to make sense out of my life. So I came to the conclusion that I was bad. God knew I was bad, so God made me handicapped to punish me. I thought that the undertow of sadness in my family was because of me. Later, I realized that a part of it might have been due to my handicap. But there was still a lot of grieving going on. Father turned to alcohol and was a very angry man. When we were growing up, he was very critical. I was told things on a daily basis, like I was dumb and lazy. When I started school, I truly realized how different I was from the other children. The children were very cruel and made fun of me. I could tell you many stories of times I was treated badly, and although the stories would be different, the feeling was always the same. I was not good enough, and it hurt. Special education was mostly for the mentally retarded, so I did not get much support from my teachers, though there were two teachers who made a difference in my life. One was a third grade teacher who got me large print books. It felt so good that someone understood I had a problem. But that was overruled by the embarrassment I felt trying to carry these big books around. The other teacher was a freshman high school teacher who flunked me. It was as if I heard her say, "You can do better." All the other teachers just let me pass, whether I knew the material or not. When I got out of high school, I felt as if I had gotten out of some sort of prison. I graduated 150th out of a class of 152, and I honestly felt that I was done. It was during my high school years that I discovered alcohol, and my problems were over. Now I was pretty and smart. For the first time, I felt as if I fit in. I still could not see. Oh well, no big deal. It felt good. I got married and had 2 children. I married a man who was not or could not be honest. For several years after we were married, I did not drink. My sister went through a divorce and moved out to town. To be a good sister, I went out with her, for she's new one in that town. We went to a country western place that had a beer bust. You just paid a certain amount to get in, and you could drink all you wanted. I thought I'd arrived in heaven. We did this several times a week, and then she started meeting people and dating. Well, I couldn't drive, so I started drinking more and more at home. Several years later, alcohol had control over my life. I had a t-shirt that I just loved. It said, I used to hate myself in the morning. Now I sleep till noon. Uh, that feeling described my feelings totally. When my daughter had to go to the hospital, I stayed sober for the 5 days she was there and told myself that I'd licked the alcohol problem. On the way home from the hospital, I got drunk again. I cannot tell you the number of times I tried to stop on my own. My son would look at me and say, Mom, why do you have to drink so much? He was about 11 years old at the time. So one night, I got down on my knees and said, God, change me or let me die. It was at this point in my life that I called Alcoholics Anonymous and asked for help. They sent two ladies over to my house. They sat with me, and I told them that I drank because my marriage was bad. One of the ladies held my hand and said, That is not why you drink. I told them I drank because I was a part German. She patted my hand and said, No, that is not why you drink. Then I told them I drank because I was legally blind. They said again, No, that is not why you drank. They explained that alcoholism is a disease. They shared their stories with me and told how alcohol had taken over their lives as well. I started going to meetings, and my story sounded so dull next to some of the stories I had heard. But the most interesting thing I could think to tell was about the time my friends, who were also drunk, let me drive the car. I almost got us all killed, but what fun! Legally blind, drunk, and behind the wheel. God was really taking care of me and the other people that night. I just didn't know it at the time. The truth is, most of my drinking was done alone. I would call people and talk, and the following mornings were awful, trying to piece together what I had said. I would say things to my husband like, Wasn't that an interesting call last night? Hoping he would volunteer information. My hands were beginning to shake without the booze. Yet, when I got to AA, I wasn't sure I belonged because my drunkalog was not that exciting. Then, at an AA meeting, a friend said that even though he had been to jail and done lots and lots of stuff, he was no different than me. He felt the same things I felt. It was then I knew I was not unique, that the people did understand the pain inside me. I met a lady who had a handicapped child, and we learned so much from each other. One important thing that I learned was that handicapped is not a four-letter word. Handicapped is not a dirty word. I learned that I was not bad, that I was one of God's special children, and that God had a plan for my life too. The people of AA showed me how my past could become an asset. I got a sponsor and started working the steps. The promises of the big book started coming true for me. The feeling of uselessness and self-pity went away, and I could see how my experiences could help others. When I was 3 years sober, I made one of the most difficult decisions I had ever made. I left the marriage. I did not leave because I did not love him. I still love him, but the marriage was not a healthy place for me. I found myself with 2 children to support. I was legally blind and had no job skills. When I moved out, I first moved into public housing for blind folks. This was a shocking experience for me, but it was full of growth. For the first time in my life, I was learning to accept my handicap. Before this, I would plan out my day as if I could see, and then plan it out again based on the fact that my vision was limited. Through the Commission for the Blind, I got involved in a program that helps blind people become self-employed. After 3 months of training, I moved to a city a couple 100 miles away where I knew no one. I lived in an apartment that was about a mile from a coffee shop that I operated. I would walk to work at 6:30 in the morning, carrying $200 in opening cash on a dark road. I was afraid. I had 2 people working for me, and on my second day, one of them didn't show up. I had never run a business before, and my 3 months of training just didn't seem enough. It was a hard time for me. A lady from a major food company came by to take my grocery order, and I didn't have a clue how much coffee, bacon, or hamburger meat I needed. She shared with me what the previous manager had ordered, and that helped me place an order. God only knows how we got on the subject, but she was a member of AA and later became my new sponsor. She picked me up and took me to meetings. At one of the meetings, I met a man who for the next year picked me up and drove me to work. I paid him $1 each morning. I'm sure that did not cover his gas, but it helped me to feel I was paying my way. For the first time in my life, I was now supporting myself. This is just an example of how God works in my life. No longer did I have to drink, but it was much more than that. Everything I needed was provided. I had a God of my understanding that helped me in every aspect of my life. In working the steps, my life changed. I think different today. I feel different today. I am new. We have a sign at the AA meeting. It says, expect a miracle. My sobriety is full of miracles. When my son filled out an application for college, I filled one out too and was accepted. Soon I will be a senior and have a 3.71 grade point average, thanks to AA. I've come a long way from being near the bottom of my high school class. It takes me a lot longer to read the material. So, I have a CCTV. I put my book under this camera and it comes out in big print on a monitor. I have a talking calculator that helped me get through statistics and a telescope that can help me see the board. I accept help from the Disabled Student Services and gladly make use of the volunteer note takers. I learned to accept the things I could not change, in this case, my vision, and change the things I can. I would be grateful for and accept the visual aids instead of being embarrassed and rejecting them as I had when I was younger. I've already told you about some of the miracles that have happened. However, there's more. I want to tell you how I feel inside. I'm no longer spiritually bankrupt. It's as if I have a magic source in my life that has provided me with all I need. I just celebrated my 12th year of sobriety a couple months ago. When I first came to AA, I didn't know who I was. My sponsor said, "Great. If you don't know who you are, you can be whoever God wants you to be." Today, I am doing more things than I ever dreamed possible. More importantly, it is the peace and serenity I feel that keeps me coming back. I have been through hard times in and out of sobriety, but before AA, it didn't matter how good things got. I always had a feeling that something was wrong. Since AA, it doesn't matter how bad things get. I always have a feeling that everything is going to be all right. And working the 12 steps, my life and my old ways of thinking have changed. I have no control over some things that happen in my life, but with the help of God, I can now choose how I will respond. Today, I choose to be happy. When I'm not, I have the tools of this program to put me back on the right track. Chapter 13. Me? An alcoholic? Alcohol's ringer squeezed this author, but he escaped quite whole. When I try to reconstruct what my life was like before, I see a coin with two faces. One, the side I turned to myself and the whole world, was respectable, even in some ways distinguished. I was a father, husband, taxpayer, homeowner. I was a club man, athlete, artist, musician, author, editor, aircraft pilot, and world traveler. I was listed in Who's Who in America as an American who, by distinguished achievement, had arrived. The other side of the coin was sinister, baffling. I was inwardly unhappy most of the time. There would be times when the life of respectability and achievement seemed insufferably dull. I had to break out. This I would do by going completely bohemian for a night, getting drunk and rolling home with the dawn. Next day, remorse would be on me like a tiger. I'd claw my way back to respectability and stay there until the inevitable next time. The insidiousness of alcoholism is an appalling thing. In all the 25 years of my drinking, there were only a few occasions when I took a morning drink. My binges were one night stands only. Once or twice during my early drinking, I carried it over into the second day, and only once, that I can remember, did it continue into the third. I was never drunk on the job, never missed a day's work, and was seldom rendered totally unaffected by a hangover, and kept my liquor expenses well within my budget. I continued to advance in my chosen field. How could such a man possibly be called an alcoholic? Whatever the root of my unhappiness might turn out to be, I thought it could not possibly be the booze. Of course, I drank. Everyone did in the set which I regarded as the apex of civilization. My wife loved to drink, and we tied-armed many a hooter in the name of marital bliss. My associates and all the wits and literary lights I so admired also drank. Evening cocktails were as a standard as morning coffee, and I suppose my average daily consumption ran a little more or less than a pint. Even on my rare at first binge nights, it never ran much more than a quart. How easy it was in the beginning to forget that those binges ever happened. After a day or two of groveling remorse, I'd come up with an explanation. The nervous tension had piled up and just had to spill over. Or my physical plant had got a little run down and the stuff rushed right to my head. Or I got to talking and forgot how many I was taking and it hit me. Always we'd emerge with a new formula for avoiding future trouble. You've got to space your drinks and take plenty of water in between, or coat the stomach with a little olive oil, or drink anything but those damned martinis. Weeks would go by without further trouble. I'd be assured I'd at last hit the right formula. The binge had been just one of those things. After a month, it seemed unlikely that it happened. Intervals between binges were 8 months. My growing inward unhappiness was a very real thing, however, and I knew that something would have to be done about it. A friend had found help in psychoanalysis after a particularly ugly one-nighter. My wife suggested that I try it, and I agreed. Educated child of the scientific age that I was, I had complete faith in the science of the mind. It would be a sure cure and also an adventure. How exciting to learn the inward mysteries that govern the behavior of people. How wonderful to know at last all about myself. To cut a long story short, I spent 7 years and over $10,000 on my psychiatric adventure and emerged in worse condition than ever. To be sure, I learned many fascinating things and many things that were to prove helpful later. I learned what a devastating effect it can have on a child to coddle him and build him up, and then turn and beat him savagely, as had happened to me. Meanwhile, I was getting worse, both as regards my inward misery and my drinking. My daily alcoholic consumption remained about the same through all this, with perhaps a slight increase, and my binges remained one-nighters, but they were occurring with alarming frequency. In 7 years, the intervals between them decreased from 8 months to 10 days, and they were growing uglier. One night, I barely made it, my downtown club. If I had to go just another 50 feet, I'd collapsed in the gutter. On another occasion, I arrived home covered in blood. I deliberately smashed a window. With all this, it was becoming increasingly hard to maintain my front of distinction and respectability to the world. My personality was stretched almost to splitting point. In the effort, schizophrenia stared me dead in the face, and one night I was in suicidal despair. My professional life looked fine on the surface. I was now head of a publishing venture in which nearly $1 million had been invested. My opinions were quoted in Time and Newsweek, along with pictures. I addressed the public by radio and TV. It was a fantastic structure, built on a crumbling foundation. It was tottering, and it had to fall. It did. After my last binge, I come home and smashed out. After my last binge, I come home and smashed my dining room furniture to splinters. I kicked out 6 windows and 2 balustrades. When I woke up sober, my handiwork confronted me. It is impossible for me to reproduce my despair. I'd had absolute faith in science, and only in science. Knowledge is power, I'd always been taught. Now, I had to face up to the fact that knowledge of this sort, applied to my individual case, was not power. Science could take my mind apart expertly, but it couldn't seem to put it together again. I crawled back to my analyst, not so much because I had faith in him, but because I had nowhere else to turn. After talking with him for a time, I heard myself saying, "Doc, I think I might be an alcoholic." "Yes," he said, "surprisingly, you are." "Then why in God's name haven't you told me so during all these years?" "Well, 2 reasons," he said. "First, I couldn't be sure. The line between a heavy drinker and an alcoholic is not always clear. It wasn't until just lately that, in your case, I could draw it. Second, you wouldn't have believed me even if I had told you." I had to admit to myself that he was right. Only through being beaten down by my own misery would I have ever accepted the term alcoholic as applied to myself. Now, however, I accepted it fully. I knew from my general reading that alcoholism was irreversible and fatal, and I knew that somewhere along the line I had lost the power to stop drinking. "Well, Doc," I said, "what are we going to do?" "There's nothing I can do, and nothing medicine can do. However, I've heard of an organization called Alcoholics Anonymous that has had some success with people like you. They make no guarantees and are not always successful. But if you want to, you're free to try them. It might work." Many times in the intervening years, I have thanked God for that man, a man who had the courage to admit failure, a man who had the humility to confess that all the hard-won learning of his profession could not turn up the answer. I looked up an AA meeting and went there alone. Here I found an ingredient that had been lacking in any other effort I had made to save myself. Here was power. Here was power to live to the end of any given day, power to have the courage to face the next day, power to have friends, power to help people, power to be sane, power to stay sober. That was 7 years ago, and many AA meetings ago, and I haven't had a drink during those 7 years. Moreover, I am deeply convinced that so long as I continue to strive in my bumbling way towards the principles I first encountered in the earlier chapters of this book, this remarkable power will continue to flow through me. What is this power? With my AA friends, all I can say is that it's a power greater than myself. If pressed, all I could do is follow the psalmist who said it long before me. Be still and know that I am God. My story has a happy ending, but not the conventional kind. I had a lot more hell to go through, but what a difference there is between going through hell without a power greater than oneself and with it. As might have been predicted, uh, my teetering tower of worldly success collapsed. My alcoholic associates fired me, took control, and ran the enterprise into bankruptcy. My alcoholic wife took up with someone else, divorced me, and took with her all my remaining property. The most terrible blow of my life befell me after I'd found sobriety through AA. Perhaps the single flicker of decency that shone through the fog of my drinking days was a clumsy affection for my two children, a boy and a girl. One night, my son, when he was only 16, was suddenly and tragically killed. The higher power was on deck to see me through sober. I think he's on hand to see my son through too. There have been some wonderful things too. My new wife and I don't own any property to speak of, and the flashy successes of another day are no longer mine. But we have a baby who, if you'll pardon a little post-alcoholic sentimentality, is right out of heaven. My work is on a much deeper and more significant level than it ever was before. I am, today, fairly creative and relatively sane as a human being. And should I have more bad times, I know that I'll never again have to go through them alone. Chapter 14: The Perpetual Quest. This lawyer tried psychiatrists, biofeedback, relaxation exercises, and a host of other techniques to control her drinking. She finally found a solution that worked, uniquely tailored in the 12 steps. When I was a newly minted lawyer, starting out in the practice of criminal law, there were 5 of us in our law office. My favorite lawyer was the eccentric, disheveled, wild-eyed Irish law professor, who was brilliant or crazy, depending on your point of view, constantly cleaning out his pipe bowl with a black fingernail and tossing back vodka martinis whenever he got the chance. Then there was the new but world-weary litigation lawyer who told endless tales of his former life, of white wine and bouillabaisse under the Mediterranean sun as he conducted his exporting business on the Riviera. Why would he leave such an ideal, wine-drenched job in sunny climes to slog away at law school? I kept wondering. There was also a giant, good-hearted bear of a man who today is a judge, who spent more time listening and helping others than he did practicing criminal law. Into this office landed a pair of know-it-all, fast-acting, but not too experienced young lawyers, my husband and me. Within a dozen years, 3 of the 5 promising lawyers were dead from alcohol, struck down at the peak of their careers. The judge is still, and always has been, a sober judge. and I somehow unwittingly, and even while drinking, turned into a corporate counsel and later, thankfully, became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. The professor's kidneys gave out from one too many martinis. The ex-sporting lawyer kept drinking until he died. Despite a liver transplant, my ex-husband died in a firearm what was to be, he had said, his last drunk before going to AA again. When I was 10 years sober, I have been to many premature funerals due to our good friend alcohol. My husband and I met and married in law school in a romantic haze of alcohol, twinkling lights, and much promise. We stood out as the only young married couple in our class. We worked and played hard, camped and hiked and skied, threw fabulous parties for our sophisticated friends, and prided ourselves on staying away from drugs. In fact, it was fear that kept me away from drugs, fear that I might not get called to the bar. That's the other bar, the legal one. If I were convicted of possession of illegal street drugs, more importantly, my best friend was wonderful, powerful alcohol, and I loved him. Until I was 4 years old, I lived upstairs from a tavern where I saw a few drunks who bounced around. My mother worked for relatives who also lived over the tavern, and whoever had time looked after me. Despite my pleas, my mother married a violent man, and we moved away to a life that made my tavern life look really holy. I kept running away back to the tavern until it was demolished. I still fondly look at the pictures of that place. By the age of 14, I had my first drunk, which ended in a minor police visit to my home. By the age of 18, I was a daily drinker. By age 21, I had my first year-long binge in France, which I euphemistically referred to as my steady year abroad. I come home very sick and drunk. A few months later, I went to bed with a bottle of scotch one night and decided I would go to law school. If you are having trouble, try something that is even more difficult just to show them. That was my philosophy. It was enough to drive me to drink, and drink I did. At law school, we used to drink a lot of beer in student pubs, debating whether rocks had souls and what was the nature of the judicial process, as though it had never been considered before. As new lawyers, my husband and I eagerly beavered into the office early in the morning before running off to court to fearlessly defend the downtrodden. Lunch was the training ground for the perpetual quest for the best martini, usually two or three of them, good for taking away the knot that by this time had permanently lodged itself in my stomach. I didn't know that it represented fear, and that I was not a fearless defender after all. Afternoons would be full of creative legal arguments in court. If court finished early, maybe we'd make it back to the office. Maybe not. Evenings, we drank with the best of them. Lawyers, writers, media types, everyone vying to tell the best stories. which of course got funnier and funnier the more we drank and the later it got. When I drank, the fear evaporated. I became articulate and apparently very, very funny, or so they said then. Years later, I drank so much that I was no longer funny. But at the time, the drinks and the stories and the camaraderie were as wonderful as I was witty. We would get home to sleep by 1 or 2 in the morning, and the next day we would be up early to start all over again. The fortitude and resilience of youth made us invincible. Unfortunately, by the time we thought it was time to have a real life and maybe start a family, the marriage disintegrated. I was then 28 years old, getting divorced, drinking all the time, and seeing a psychiatrist 3 times a week, trying to solve my problem, whatever it was. I thought I had found part of the answer when I stumbled into a private controlled drinking program, which helped me during the initial 30-day mandatory period of abstinence. Took a very large rug, row by row, well into many late nights. One more row, I kept saying, gritting my teeth against a drink. My period of abstinence also helped me get a better job in the corporate world, away from all those hard drinking criminal lawyers, and a new 3-story, 4-bedroom house. Just what every single woman needs. It helped me to quit the psychiatrist. During this abstinence, I also got out of a sick relationship, which reproduced the violence of my childhood. Incredibly, I did not connect the improved manageability of my life in this short period of abstinence to the abstinence of booze. It didn't matter in the long run because unfortunately I started to get drunk again. I recall being fixated on that first glass of wine. I was allowed to drink the day my coach informed me that I was ready to start drinking in controlled fashion. My tongue was almost hanging out. Many drunks later, I tried everything I could. More therapy, different psychiatrists. It was always to be the next one who would solve the problem. Biofeedback, relaxation exercises, and abuse. Lots of self-help books, from Freud to Jung, to every current fad that was ever published or taught, all to no avail. Of course, because I'd always end up drunk. Came the day when I realized that I couldn't keep dragging myself off to work in the morning and spending half the energy of every day concealing the fact that I was a barely functioning drunk. I would go home to drink until I passed out, come to in the middle of the night terrified. I'd listen to the radio and get worldwide telephonitis, finally dozing off at dawn, just in time to be awakened by the alarm and start the process all over again. I gave up on relationships of any significance, saw my friends less, and I stopped committing myself to more social occasions because I just could never count on being sober. More and more, I just worked to drink, and the drinking was starting to outstrip the working. One day, I was so hungover at lunchtime, I called a friend and had a little cry. I've tried everything and nothing works," I said, reciting my litany of doctors and different therapies. I did not remember that 13 years earlier, when I was 21 years old, I had attended a few meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous after waking up one morning, not knowing where I was. I just started law school and was terrified most of the time. So I went on a binge to quell the fear, which only got worse. I have no idea what made me go to AA back then, but there were no young people at the meetings, and people kept marveling at how young and fresh I looked. No one at AA said that when I came back 13 years later. My friend suggested that we contact a man she knew was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I agreed to call him. "Perhaps he could call you," she said helpfully, which was the key, because that night I was just fine, and I didn't need any outside help aside from a drink or two. But he kept phoning and bothering me about going to a meeting. When he told me he went to AA meetings 3 or 4 times a week, I thought, poor man, he has nothing better to do. What a boring life it must be for him, running around to AA meetings with nothing to drink. Boring indeed. No bouncing off walls, no falling down stairs, and no regular trips to hospital emergency rooms, lost cars, etc. My first meeting back at AA was on an unseasonably hot June night, but there was not a cool drink in sight in that church basement. The smoke could have choked a horse. Today it is much improved, and a fanatical woman with smiling bright eyes eagerly explained to me that they had this important book I should buy. Thinking that they were doing the book promotion because they needed the money, I said firmly, "I'll give you the money, but I don't want your book," which about sums up my attitude and explains why. For the next few months, I continued to get drunk, in spite of dragging my body to meetings every few days. I would stare at the large bottle of vodka in my kitchen cupboard and said, "You won't get me." But it did. I always lost the battle and ended up drunk. My last hangover was on a Friday, before a long summer weekend. I had struggled through the day, feeling small and hopeless, hiding the trembling of my hands when I had to sign documents, and desperately working to wrap my tongue around words during meetings. Later that Friday night, after an agonizing long workday, I was dragging myself up the deserted street thinking that the whole world, except for me, had some place to go on that long weekend. And what's more, they all had someone to go with. The first difference between that night and all the others was that I did not immediately go directly to a bar to get lubricated or hung with my regular giant weekend supply of booze. Instead, I went to my club to swim, where, strangely enough, I also did not drink. I was so hungover that I decided to give up trying to swim, and instead wrapped myself in a bathrobe and sat in a dark corner of the locker room lounge for 2 hours, feeling desperately sorry for myself. I don't know what happened during those hours, but close to 8 o'clock, I leaped up, jumped into my clothes, and raced off to a meeting. I had no intention of attending this meeting. It was a bit like getting a rap on the head with an invisible hammer and having my brain flip over, because the meeting seemed to be radically different from the last time. The people looked animatedly alive. The weirdos who had been attending before were absent that night, and the books on display actually looked interesting. I bought the Alcoholics Anonymous book, listened intently, and then for the first time I went for coffee with those people and listened some more. Like that night at home, there was a presence in the room with me, even though I lived alone. The next morning, I knew I didn't have to drink. That night, I went to a step meeting where they discussed step 2. I came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I actually talked about God, the one who had abandoned me when I was very little, very frightened, and very hurt. In the weeks and months that follows, I did everything that was suggested to me. I went to a meeting a day, read the books and literature, and even got a sponsor. He told me to have a quiet time every morning and to pray and meditate, or at least sit still for a few minutes before racing off for the day. Since I prided myself on adhering to the intellectual principle of not having contempt for anything prior to investigation, I tried to keep an open mind, no matter what anyone said and how stupid I thought it was. That probably saved my life. I joined a downtown group that met near my office right after work at 5:15. I would not have made it to 8 p.m. Soon, I got into service. I was given bank books, notes of business meetings, and various other instructions, and told to do whatever was necessary to keep the meetings going. I did that job for quite some time. I also instituted regular business meetings and found an eager newcomer, to whom I eventually turned over the bank book and the papers. I had a lot of problems in those early days, but no matter what the problem, I was repeatedly told to seek more spiritual development, something that did not interest me. I was also told that my purpose here on earth was to be of maximum service to God and to the people around me. That didn't interest me either. However, I said nothing, interested, listened, and kept going to meetings, mostly step discussions, where I heard people talk about how they practice the steps and about the big book. Our selfishness and helping others. Sometimes I thought they were nuts. Those meetings, often I thought they were boring, but I kept listening and tried to relate. Soon after, a friend of mine was killed by a drunk going the wrong way on the freeway. A truck driver talked about driving long hauls drunk. I was horrified and repelled until I paused to recall that I used to drive when I couldn't even walk straight. When my friend was killed, my AA meetings said, "Do not drink, don't think, just go to meetings." I went to a meeting where I sobbed and gnashed my teeth, but I did not drink. I became as compulsive about AA as I had been about drinking, which was necessary because I had been told to spend as much time at meetings as I had spent drinking. I went to every AA get together possible and was saturated with AA. I listened to tapes of AA talks. I read and reread the literature and the books, laughing into the night over Dr. Bob and the good old timers. I signed up for the Loners Internationalist meeting in print and shared the meetings I attended in letters to people who could not get to meetings. This helped me to remember what I had heard, and my sharing helped someone. I once wrote to a man who had received my letter the same day he had killed someone in a car accident, which would no doubt make one very, very thirsty. Many years later, though, alcohol is no longer part of my life, and I no longer have the compulsion to drink. It can still occur to me what a good drink tastes like and what it can do for me. For my standard attention, alcoholic taste buds right down to my stretched out, tingling toes. As my sponsor used to point out, such thoughts are like red flags, telling me that something is not right, that I am stretched beyond my sober limit. It's time to get back to basics. AA, and see what needs changing. That special relationship with alcohol will always be there, waiting to seduce you again. I can stay protected by continuing to be an active member of AA. The hardest thing I had to deal with in sobriety was my own anger and the violence I had lived through in my childhood. I had forgiven those involved as best as I could, but the mind seems to never forget. I was gratefully received years of outside help because I was told that my drinking was only the symptom of deeper troubles. Yet, despite the help of many professionals, I know I would never have recovered from violence and alcohol without AA's 12 steps, which are uniquely tailored for people just like me. Just as importantly, I believe that I recovered through the grace of a higher power, despite the fact that I was very angry and wanting nothing to do with God when I arrived at AA. In fact, I did not need to find God. I only needed an open mind, and the Spirit found me. When I was 5 years sober, I met a man in AA who was also 5 years sober. He said that the rocks in my head fit the holes in his. Today, we have a doctor who has never seen her parents drink and who sees them try to help others in AA. We have a nice home and a sober family life in a community with lots of AA friends and meetings. It's a long, long way from that first meeting, and it couldn't get much better.